Wren Talbot walked into the proctor's hall with a Duskwarden hatchling wedged under one arm and a Vorlynx kit clinging to her shoulder. And the room went silent the way a room goes silent right before someone gets hurt. Cadet Talbot. Instructor Dreeth Van did not look up from the data slate on his podium. His voice carried the flat, patient cruelty of a man who has already decided how the next 10 minutes will end. You were ordered to report alone. They don't do alone, Wren said. Not yet. The hatchling Ash, all elbows and unfinished armor plate, dark gray-green scales still soft at the seams, pressed its narrow skull into her ribs and made a sound like a kettle deciding whether to boil. The kid on her shoulder, Fen, silver blue and barely bigger than a house cat, didn't make a sound at all. Fen just watched Van with two flat gold eyes, the way something watches a door it doesn't trust. 40 cadets sat in the tiered benches around the hall, Thren in their bronze collar rings, Sylph with their forearms folded into their thoraxes in the attentive posture their species used instead of crossed arms, two Corrigal boys who'd stopped mid-whisper, and in the back row, alone, the only other human cadet on the moon besides Wren, a boy named Cole Hasker who would not meet her eyes. Above them all on the observation tier stood Commandant Rurik Vash, silver-maned, arms behind his back, watching everything and saying nothing yet. Van finally looked up. His pupils were vertical slits that widened, very slightly, when they found the cubs. Unauthorized care of predator-class fauna, he read, each word deliberate, concealment of non-registered organisms inside academy housing, and falsification of a beast pen disposal log. He set the slate down. You have made yourself very interesting, cadet. Wren said nothing. Ash's claws, blunt as they still were, pricked small crescents into her sleeve. That was how it started. 6 months earlier, nobody would have called Wren Talbot interesting. She was pen duty, third rotation, the human girl who mucked out the beast wards because Earth cadets weren't cleared for anything with a trigger yet. Humanity had joined the coalition 11 years back. 11 years wasn't long enough. The instructors liked to say, not long enough to prove you wouldn't panic, wouldn't flinch, wouldn't do something stupid with a war beast that could take your arm off before your brain finished registering the word danger. So the human cadets swept and fed and cleaned, and watched the alien cadets train with animals that outweighed them 10 to 1, and were told this was an honor, a first step patience. Wren didn't mind the pens. She minded a lot of other things about Praxis Reach Academy, the way conversation stopped when she walked into a mess hall, the way her drill instructor pronounced human like it was a diagnosis, but she didn't mind the pens. Animals didn't stop talking when she walked in. Animals didn't need her to prove anything first. She found Ash on a night duty nobody wanted, in the cull crate behind Ward 9, half buried under 3 siblings who'd already stopped moving. The Duskwarden brood had come in weak, a bad clutch, and the pen master had made the call the way pen masters were required to make it. The strong ones went to the training program, the weak ones went to the incinerator, because a Duskwarden's whole purpose on this moon was growing into 600 pounds of armored muscle for the Academy's combat drills, and there was no institutional patience for one that might not make weight. Ash was the smallest of the 4. Ash was still breathing. Wren didn't decide anything grand that night. She decided one small thing. She was not putting a breathing animal into an incinerator chute on her watch. And everything after that was just the slow avalanche that one decision started rolling. Fen came 4 weeks later, found half-drowned in a runoff channel after a supply barge's ballast tank ruptured near the Vorlynx breeding warren the Academy kept for its scent tracking program. Nobody claimed him. The warren keeper said kits that small, that sick, weren't worth the medicine. Wren spent 2 nights hand-feeding him with a dropper stolen from the infirmary stores, and on the 3rd night he stopped shivering and bit her thumb hard enough to draw blood, and something in her chest that had been braced for a long time finally came unbraced. She hid them in the loft above Ward 9, in a nest of old packing straw and a stolen heat coil. She fed them out of her own ration credits. She told exactly one person. "You understand," Yesney Kaur said the first time she saw them, antennae swiveling in the slow figure eight her species made when they were doing math they didn't like the answer to, "that if this is discovered you will not simply be disciplined. You will be removed, sent home. Do you understand this, Ren?" "I understand it. And you are doing it anyway." "Somebody has to." Ren had Finn tucked into her jacket at the time, a small furious lump against her sternum, and Ash asleep with its blunt snout resting on her boot. Nobody else was going to. Yeseni's mandibles clicked, the Sylph equivalent, Ren had learned, of a long exhale. "Then I did not see this," she said, and never mentioned it again, and brought scrap meat from the officers' mess twice a week for 6 months without ever once asking to be thanked. That was the part nobody in the proctor's hall knew, the night it all came apart. That it hadn't been recklessness. It had been care, sustained, deliberate for half a year, by a girl everyone on this moon had already decided was too soft for anything that mattered. The pen master found the loft on a supply inventory nobody had scheduled. He didn't tell Ren first. He told Instructor Van, because Van was the ranking officer for beast discipline, and Van had spent 11 years watching human cadets get folded gently into the coalition's lowest tiers, and had opinions about what that softness would eventually cost people who trusted it. So now Ren stood in the proctor's hall with both cubs in her arms, and Van had a charge sheet, and 40 cadets had a Tuesday afternoon suddenly worth staying awake for. "I am not interested in your reasons," Van said before she could offer any. "I am interested in outcomes. You have raised 2 predator-class organisms outside every safety protocol this academy operates on. No behavioral conditioning, no handler certification, no containment review. You fed a Duskwarden by hand for 6 months, and you are surprised it imprinted on you instead of its own kind." He said imprinted the way another man might say infected. "That is not affection, Cadet Talbot. That is a liability wearing a cute face, and liabilities on this moon get corrected." "Corrected how?" Ren's voice didn't rise. It rarely did. She'd learned a long time ago that rising voices were a currency she didn't have enough of to spend. Van almost smiled. It was the first genuine expression he'd shown all afternoon. Disposal is standard for unregistered predator-class fauna above weaning age. "I could simply invoke it." He let that sit in the hall for a 3 count, watching it land, watching, Ren realized, not her but the room, gauging how many cadets flinched at the word, and filing that away as more evidence for whatever argument he was building. "But I find myself curious. So I am going to offer you something more interesting than disposal." Above them, Commandant Vash shifted his weight, a small motion, the only sign he'd registered that word, interesting, as something worth watching closely. "A live evaluation," Van said. "This afternoon. Bring your cubs to the training yard. If they are genuinely bonded, genuinely safe, genuinely worth the exception you're asking this institution to make, they will hold steady under controlled stress. If they are simply feral animals that happen to like the hand that feeds them, that will become apparent very quickly, and no one in this hall will need to feel guilty about what happens next." His eyes went to the cubs one more time, and something in them, not hunger exactly, but its cousin, the satisfaction of a man watching a plan click into place, made the hair on Ren's arms rise before she understood why. "I already have the subject selected. Report to Yard 3 at 1400. "What subject?" Ren said. Van's smile finally arrived in full. It did not reach anywhere near his eyes. "Caro," he said. Somewhere in the tiered benches, a Thren cadet Osek Ren registered distantly. Van's favorite made a small, delighted sound, like a man watching a bet he'd placed come home. Ren didn't know the name yet. She would, within the hour, learn exactly what it meant to every other creature on this moon, and exactly why Van had chosen it, and exactly how close he had just come to getting what he actually wanted. Fenn's claws tightened on her shoulder. Ash went very still against her ribs. Neither cub took its eyes off Van as he stepped down from the podium and walked past them, close enough that his robe brushed Ren's sleeve, close enough that she felt, for just a second, gone before she could be sure of it, Ash's whole small body coil like a spring deciding whether this was, finally, the moment to strike. 1400, Van said again, not looking back. Don't be late, cadet. It would be a shame to keep Caro waiting. Cole Hasker caught her in the corridor outside, the first time he'd spoken to her in a month. He kept his voice low, the way you talk near a live wire. Caro's the war beast they keep for the graduation duels. Full-grown Duskwarden. They don't feed it right, Ren. I've heard the pen crew talk. They keep it lean and mean on purpose, so it hits like the real thing when they run the senior combat trials. It's put 2 Thren cadets in the infirmary the last 2 years. It's not an evaluation. It's a sentence. Then why hasn't he just invoked the disposal order and skipped the theater? Cole didn't have an answer to that, and neither in the moment did she. She would understand it within the hour, because disposal was quiet, and quiet didn't teach the room anything. Van wanted 40 cadets watching when the human girl's soft little project came apart in the mouth of something built to end it. He wanted it to be a lesson, not a paperwork entry. That was the difference between cruelty that hides and cruelty that performs. She carried both cubs across the yard in the white afternoon light, past the observation rail where the same 40 cadets had already reassembled, packed 3 deep now, word having traveled the way word always traveled on a moon with nothing else to talk about. Yesney was there, near the front, and Tenny dead still, the Sylph version of white-knuckled. Cole stood near her, arms crossed like he could brace something with his own body if it came to that. Commandant Vash stood apart from the rest, on the raised observation platform, hands still behind his back, his expression unreadable in the way older officers cultivated on purpose. Yard 3 was a bowl of packed red clay, 40 meters across, ringed by a containment fence twice Ren's height. At its far end stood a gate of scored black alloy, and behind that gate, something breathed. Ash had gone rigid under her arm the moment they crossed the threshold. Fenn's ears had flattened all the way back against his skull. Neither cub made a sound. Ren had learned in 6 months of pen duty that silence in a young predator wasn't calm. It was concentration. Van stood at the gate controls himself, which told her something too. A lesser instructor would have delegated this, but Van wanted his hand on the lever. He looked, for the first time all day, genuinely pleased. Set them down, cadet. They stay with me. That is not how a controlled evaluation works. You will place both organisms on the yard floor at the center mark and step back to the rail. If the bond you claim is real, they will hold position, remain calm, and demonstrate handler-independent stability, which is the minimum standard for any predator-class fauna permitted to remain on this installation. If they cannot do that much, Cadet Talbot, then they were never anything but strays you got attached to, and I will have done you the favor of proving it before you got any more attached. It was, Ren understood with a cold clarity, a test built to fail. 2 young cubs alone on open ground with an underfed war beast about to be released 20 meters away. There was no version of calm that survived that, bond or no bond. He wasn't testing whether they loved her. He was testing whether fear could override it, and fear always could, given enough teeth. She looked up at Vash. The commandant's face didn't move. Whatever rules governed this yard, he wasn't going to bend them from the platform, not without cause. She would have to give him one. So Ren did the only thing she had left. She knelt at the center mark, set both cubs down on the warm clay, kept one hand flat against Ash's back and 2 fingers resting light on the ruff at Fenn's neck, and said, quiet enough that only the cubs could have heard it, "Stay close. Whatever happens, stay close to me." Then she stood, and did not step back to the rail. Cadet Talbot, Van said, an edge finally showing under the calm. The handler steps back. The handler stays with her cubs, Wren said. That's the whole point you're trying to disprove, isn't it? Prove it with me standing here. A ripple went through the observation rail. A Corrigal cadet actually laughed, short and disbelieving before catching himself. Van's jaw worked once. For a moment Wren thought he might simply order her physically removed. Instead, something colder crossed his face, a recalculation, and he decided, she watched him decide it, that her staying only made the lesson better. A war beast that had put 2 Thren cadets in the infirmary would not pause for a human girl standing in the wrong place. If anything, her death or maiming would end this argument permanently and end her career alongside it, and he would be able to say, with a perfectly clean conscience, that she'd been warned. "Have it your way," Van said and pulled the lever. The black gate ground upward on its rails, and Caro came out of the dark behind it like a landslide finding its feet. It came fast, faster than anything that size should have moved, 600 pounds of duskwardin pouring across the yard on 4 thick legs, armor plate the color of old iron catching the light in dull flashes, a low sound coming out of it that wasn't quite a roar, more like a saw blade finding a knot in the wood. Its head was broad and wedge-shaped, built for driving through resistance, ridged along the crown in blunt bone spurs, and its eyes, when they fixed on the center of the yard, were the same banked ember orange as ashes, the exact color, the exact shape, a resemblance so immediate that Wren's chest went tight before her brain finished the thought her body had already had. They're the same species. This is what ash grows into. This is what they wanted her to see torn apart by its own kind in front of everyone. She did not run. Running was the one thing every pen manual she'd ever read said not to do, and beyond that, her feet simply refused the order. She stood over both cubs, one hand still on Ash's back, and watched 600 pounds of trained killer close the last 20 meters at a dead run. Behind her, she heard the rail go silent in the specific way. A crowd goes silent when it expects to watch something it will regret watching. 10 meters out, Caro's stride broke. It wasn't a stumble. It was deliberate, a gear change. 4 legs going from a flat charging gait to something choppier, uneven, the beast's massive head swinging low and side to side, casting. Wren would learn later was the word for it, the motion a predator makes when a scent has just overridden a command. 5 meters out, it was barely moving, stiff-legged, head down near the clay, and the sound coming out of it had changed too, the saw blade snarl fraying at the edges into something with a question in it. It stopped 2 body lengths from the cubs, close enough that Wren could see the old scarring along one flank, the collar brand seared into the hide at its shoulder, the ribs showing faintly under muscle that had been kept lean the way a blade is kept lean, on purpose, for an edge, at a cost. Close enough to smell the dried blood crusted at one nostril where a control collar had cut it recently. Close enough, finally, for the war beast to put its huge wedge-shaped head down at the level of Ash's and breathe in, long and slow, the small hatchling's scent. Ash did not run either. Ash, barely a tenth Caro's size, alone on open ground in front of the thing built to end this test, stood its ground, planted its 4 small feet, and made a sound Wren had never heard it make before. Not the kettle whistle of hunger or the low grumble of contentment, but something structured, rhythmic, almost like a greeting call. A species sound. A sound its dead siblings might have made if they'd lived long enough to learn it from someone who could teach it. Caro went very still. Then the great scarred head lowered further, past Ash entirely, until it was level with Wren's knees, and the war beast that had put 2 Thren cadets in the infirmary breathed in her scent too, 6 months of penned straw and stolen ration meat and hand-fed formula, 6 months of a smell that, Wren understood only now, standing frozen in the white afternoon light, must have carried all over her like a second skin. The scent of a den. The scent, to something built along these lines, of a caretaker. Caro made a sound low in its chest, not a snarl. A rumble, deep and slow, the kind of sound a much smaller animal might make curled against a warm stove. Then it folded its front legs and lay down in the red clay, massive head resting an arm's length from Ren's boots, and went still. For 3 full seconds, nobody at the rail made a sound at all. Then Osek Rin, somewhere in the crowd, said, "That's not," and stopped, because there wasn't an end to that sentence that made any sense. Ren stood in the yard with a war beast at her feet, and a hatchling pressed warm against her ankle, and a kit gone rigid on her shoulder. And for one long moment, the only thing she could hear was her own pulse and the wind moving dust across the clay. Then she looked up, past the rail, straight at Van, and something in his face told her this had gone very, very differently than he had planned. "Fascinating," Van said, and his voice had gone thin, stretched over something that wanted to come out as a shout. A malnourished animal recognizing an easy meal's absence. It smelled the hatchling, decided there was nothing to gain from a fight it might lose to a crowd, and made the safer choice. That is not loyalty, cadet. That is arithmetic. From the observation platform, Commandant Vash finally spoke, and his voice carried the particular weight of a man who rarely used it and therefore never had to raise it. "Instructor Van, explain to me why a Duskwarden combat animal, conditioned for 11 years to treat every unfamiliar organism in that yard as a threat to be eliminated, chose instead to lie down." "Conditioning can be inconsistent, Commandant, particularly in an animal that has been kept at 70% of standard feed weight for 3 seasons running, according to the log I pulled before I came down here," Vash said, without raising his voice at all, and something in the crowd shifted, a ripple of attention moving toward Van now instead of the yard. "I was curious what an underfed war beast would do when finally given an easy target. I did not expect this. Neither, I think, did you, which is more troubling to me than anything Cadet Talbot has done." Van's jaw tightened. Ren watched him recalculate again, faster this time, the way a man recalculates when the ground under a plan has just shifted twice in 90 seconds. He came down off the podium steps and into the yard itself, boots crunching on the clay, and Caro's head lifted a fraction at the sound, not aggressive yet, just tracking, the way a sleeping dog tracks a footstep it doesn't recognize. "If the animal is genuinely stable," Van said, loud enough for the whole rail to hear, pivoting the argument in real time, "then it will tolerate standard handling. That is the actual test, not whether it likes the girl's smell. Whether it obeys command structure regardless of sentiment." He reached to his belt and drew a short black rod, a control lance, the kind the pen crews used to move animals that didn't want to be moved. "Step back from the beast, cadet. I am going to demonstrate that its compliance is circumstantial, not structural." "Don't," Ren said. "That was not a request I made of you." Ash's low greeting chirp had already cut off. Fen, still rigid on Ren's shoulder, had begun a thin, steady hiss, ears flat, every hair along his spine standing. "Instructor," Vash said from the platform, an edge finally entering his voice, "I did not authorize." Van didn't wait for the rest of the sentence. He crossed the last few feet and jabbed the lance down toward Caro's exposed flank, toward the old collar brand, the way Ren would learn later he'd done 100 times before in the training pens, always in the same place, always where the scarring made the pain sharpest and the animal's memory of it deepest. Caro came off the ground so fast the clay sprayed in a ring around all 4 of them. It didn't go for Van's throat. Ren understood that immediately, some animal-honest part of her brain cataloging the difference in real time even as her heart slammed against her ribs. It went for the lance, jaws closing on the black rod itself, and wrenching it sideways out of Van's grip with enough force to spin the man off his feet and down onto the clay. Then it planted itself, 600 pounds of armored muscle, directly between Van and the 2 cubs and the human girl who smelled like 6 months of den care, head low, every armor plate along its spine raised, and it made a sound that had nothing questioning left in it at all. Fen dropped from Ren's shoulder and landed snarling in front of her boots, needle-fanged and half-Caro's ferocity packed into a fraction of the mass, tail lashing. Ash pressed itself flat against Ren's leg, not retreating. Ren felt it, small and trembling and refusing to move an inch backward, but positioning, the way something young does when it has decided to stand between danger and the only safety it has ever known, even though it does not yet have the size to make that stand mean anything. 3 predators, 1 human girl, and on the ground 6 feet away, an instructor who had just discovered, in front of 40 cadets and his own commandant, exactly what it looked like when the thing he'd spent 11 years calling a liability decided it had something worth dying for. "Easy," Ren said, quiet, barely above a breath. "Easy, that's enough. He's down. He's not getting back up right now. Easy." It should not have worked. A war beast mid-charge, a hissing kit, a hatchling holding a line it had no business holding. None of it should have answered to 2 words spoken quietly by a 19-year-old girl in a beast pen jacket. But Caro's raised plates settled, fractionally, at the sound of her voice, the way an idling engine settles when a hand finds the right dial. Fen's tail stopped lashing. Ash's trembling eased, though it did not move from its place at her leg. Van lay in the clay, control lance 6 feet from his outstretched hand, staring up at the 3 of them, and for the first time all afternoon his face showed something other than calculation. It showed the 40 cadets at the rail exactly what fear looked like on him. Commandant Vash came down off the platform himself, unhurried, and the crowd parted for him the way crowds part for weather. He crouched beside Van, not to help him up, Ren noticed, but to look him in the eye at ground level, a small deliberate cruelty of his own, and said, "You struck a stable animal with a pain instrument in front of 40 witnesses and your own commanding officer, after I had explicitly begun to question the protocol. Get up, instructor. We will discuss your report in my office. Not now and not in front of this yard." Van got up. He did not look at Ren again on his way out, which she understood later as its own kind of tell. A man who has lost an argument in public rarely wants to look at the person he lost it to, because looking means admitting the argument is over. Vash turned to the yard, to the war beast still planted between the human girl and the space where Van had been, to the hissing kit and the trembling hatchling still pressed against her leg. And for a long moment he simply looked, the way a man looks at a piece of evidence that has just rearranged everything he thought he understood about a subject. "Cadet Talbot," he said finally, "can you get them to stand down?" "They already have, sir, mostly." She looked down at Caro, whose plates had settled flat again but who had not moved from its position, still angled between her and the rest of the yard, still watching the gate Van had left through as though it might come back. He's not going to relax until he's sure that thing's gone. Understandable. Vash studied Caro another moment. I have read every behavioral file this academy holds on Duskwarden temperament. Nothing in 11 years of combat drill data predicted what I just watched. I want you to understand that I am not simply going to overlook the charges against you because an animal made a dramatic choice in a stressful moment. Cadet, that would be sentiment substituting for judgment, and I do not permit myself that luxury. But I am also not a fool, and I do not believe what I just saw was arithmetic. His eyes moved to Fen, still pressed low against her boots, ears finally beginning to unflatten. Nor was that. What happens now, sir? Now, Vash said, you are going to tell me everything, from the beginning, and then I am going to make some calls that Instructor Van is not going to enjoy. That evening in the Commandant's outer office, Ren told him everything: the cull crate, the ballast leak, 6 months of stolen ration credits and hidden heat coils, Yeseni's silence, the loft above Ward 9. Vash listened without interrupting, his silver-maned head tilted slightly, and when she finished he did not react the way she expected. He did not lecture her about protocol. There is a term in old Threnpen lore, he said instead, that most of my species has stopped believing in, because for 400 years no one on any registered world has seen it happen and lived to write it down properly. Denkin. It means, roughly, one who is claimed by the den rather than claiming it. A Duskwarden does not imprint on scent alone. Cadet, every penmaster on this moon will tell you that, and every penmaster on this moon is wrong, because none of them has ever raised an orphaned hatchling by hand for half a year with no institutional support and no expectation of reward. The scent isn't the mechanism. The care is. A Duskwarden brood in the wild is raised by whichever adult stays through the hardest season without abandoning the runt. That is the whole selection criteria their species evolved around. It is not about strength. It is about who stays. Wren looked down at Ash, curled now against her boot, finally asleep, small chest rising and falling. I didn't know that. Neither, I suspect, did you need to. You simply stayed. Vash folded his hands on the desk. Caro is 11 years old, Cadet, and has been the property of this Academy's combat program since it was younger than your hatchling is now. In 11 years, no handler has ever done for it what you did by accident for a creature a third its age. I do not think it recognized a scent this afternoon. I think it recognized the only kind of care its entire life has been missing, and it made a choice that had been waiting 11 years to be offered to it. Outside the office window, in the dark, Fenn had climbed the sill and pressed his small face against the glass, watching her, refusing, even now, even safe, to let more than a room's width sit between them. Van did not accept the loss quietly. Wren learned that within 2 days, when Yesney caught up with her outside the mess hall, antennae rigid with something the Sylph used instead of alarm. He has filed for an external review, Yesney said, above Commandant Vash. There is a coalition Proctor General inspecting 3 frontier academies this cycle, Farron Das, a Thren of the old military registry, very traditional, very unsympathetic to what he calls sentiment-based exceptions. Van has requested the disposal order be reinstated under regional authority, on the grounds that a combat animal attacking a ranking instructor, regardless of provocation, constitutes an unacceptable installation risk that cannot be resolved by a junior cadet's personal attachment to it. He attacked Caro first. 40 cadets saw it. He is aware of that. His argument does not deny it happened. His argument is that it does not matter, that an animal capable of that response to any stimulus, however provoked, has demonstrated it is not safely controllable, and that safety standards cannot bend to explain away the provocation after the fact. It is, Yesney added, with the particular precision her species used when they respected an argument they hated, not a stupid position. It is simply a cruel one dressed as a careful one, which is worse, because careful is harder to argue against in a formal review. The review was set for 6 days out. Wren spent them the way she'd spent the 6 months before them, quietly, without asking anyone's permission, doing the work in front of her. Caro was released from the combat program's roster entirely, pending review, and moved to the pen ward under her care, which meant she now had a Duskwarden hatchling, a Vorlynx kit, and 600 pounds of scarred adult war beast, all sharing a straw-floored ward that had never been built for any of it. Caro slept across the doorway at night, the way something guards an entrance it has decided matters. Ash learned within days to climb the ridge of Caro's spine and sleep there, small and unafraid, on the same plated back that had put 2 cadets in the infirmary. Fenn claimed the corner nearest the heat coil, and defended it against all comers with a ferocity wildly disproportionate to his size, including, on one memorable evening, Cole Hasker, who came by with a care package of stolen infirmary bandages, and left with a set of small, precise puncture marks in his boot. "He's fine," Wren told Cole, not entirely truthfully, watching Fenn stand triumphant on the boot in question. "He just doesn't know you're allowed in yet." "When does he decide I'm allowed in?" "When you keep showing up anyway." Cole kept showing up. So did Yesney, twice a week, scrap meat in hand, no longer needing to pretend she hadn't seen anything. By the fourth night, the cadets had started calling the arrangement, half mocking and half reverent, the den watch, the standing order, unwritten and unofficial, that anyone who wanted near Wren Talbot's ward after dark had to earn it past a war beast, a hatchling and a kit with excellent aim, and that once earned it held. Osek Rin, predictably, called it ridiculous within earshot of half the barracks. 2 nights later, he was seen at the ward door at an odd hour, alone, offering a strip of dried meat to Fen with the stiff, unpracticed care of someone who would rather have died than admit what he was doing. And nobody who saw it ever mentioned it to him again, because everyone understood, by then, exactly what it meant when the den watch let someone in. Wren didn't tell Vash about the growing crowd of quiet, off-duty visitors. She didn't need to. He knew everything that happened in his own installation, and the fact that he said nothing about cadets who should have been in their bunks was, itself, a kind of ruling, one he wasn't ready to make official yet, but had already made in every way that counted. Proctor General Farron Das arrived on the 5th day, and the temperature of the whole moon seemed to drop 3 degrees the moment his shuttle touched the pad. Wren met him only once before the hearing, in the corridor outside the review chamber, and it was enough. Das was old in the way Thren got old, dry-scaled, slow-blinking, every motion economized down to the minimum required, and he looked at her the way a man looks at a line item he intends to close out efficiently. "I am told," he said without preamble, "that you have formed an attachment to Academy property that has begun disrupting installation discipline. I have read Instructor Van's report. I have not yet read yours because cadets do not file reports in a proceeding of this nature. You will answer questions. You will not editorialize. Are we understood?" "Understood, sir." "Good." He looked past her toward the ward at the end of the corridor, where, even from this distance, a low, steady rumble was audible, Caro's habitual watch sound. The noise Wren had learned meant nothing was wrong yet. "I have overseen 11 Denkin claims in 40 years of service, cadet. Every one of them was sentiment mistaken for evidence. I expect this to be the 12th. He walked on without waiting for a response, and Wren stood in the corridor a long moment after he'd gone, cold in a way that had nothing to do with the moon's thin evening air. The seizure attempt came 4 hours before dawn. Wren woke to Fenn's scream, not the hiss, not the warning growl she'd learned to sleep through, but a full, ragged shriek of alarm that had her upright and moving before her eyes had finished adjusting to the dark. The ward door stood half open. 2 figures in Academy security gray were already inside, one with a capture net half deployed, the other holding a transfer crate with Ash already thrashing inside it, small claws shrieking uselessly against the reinforced mesh. Caro hit the near one before Wren had crossed half the ward. It wasn't a killing strike. She understood that even in the chaos, some clear cold part of her cataloging the restraint even as the rest of her heart hammered. It was a shoulder check, 600 pounds of armored muscle driving the man sideways into the wall hard enough to knock the breath out of him and pin him there, jaws a hand's width from his throat and no closer, a warning held at the exact edge of a promise. The second guard swung the capture net toward Caro's flank and Fen was already airborne, 12 pounds of Vorlink's kit closing needle fangs into the man's forearm with a fury that dropped both net and crate to the straw floor at once. "Stop!" Wren's voice cracked across the ward, and this time it did rise, because some situations were worth the currency after all. Caro off him now. The war beast's jaws stopped a fraction closer than they had before, held a beat longer than they had to, and then withdrew, stepping back but not away, planting itself between the pinned guard and the crate where Ash still thrashed. Fen released the second guard's arm at the sound of her voice and retreated to stand snarling over Ash's crate instead, guarding what the guards had already tried to take. "Let him out," Wren said, kneeling, hands shaking now that the moment had passed, working the crate latch until Ash tumbled free and pressed hard and trembling against her chest. "Who authorized this? Who sent you here at this hour with a transfer crate for a cadet's registered case animals mid-review?" Neither guard answered. They didn't have to. The transfer order, when Commandant Vash pulled it 20 minutes later, summoned by the ward's alarm chime, arriving in a robe with his silver mane unbound, and his expression the coldest Wren had yet seen it, carried Instructor Dreeth Van's authorization code, time-stamped 2 hours before the attempt, invoking an emergency reassignment clause meant for genuine installation emergencies, moving both cubs to a remote outpost holding facility 3 systems out, effective immediately. No review required, because emergency reassignments were, by design, meant to happen before anyone could object. Vash read the order twice. Then he looked at the 2 guards still catching their breath against the ward wall, at Caro standing immovable between them and the crate, at Ash pressed shaking into Wren's collar and Finn still hissing low warnings from the straw. "Get Proctor General Das," Vash said, in a voice Wren had never heard from him before, quiet and entirely without patience. "Wake him if you must. Tell him the 12th Denkin claim of his career just tried to have evidence removed from the record at 4 hours before dawn, and I would very much like him to see the ward exactly as it stands right now before anyone tidies it." Das arrived in under 10 minutes, robe thrown on over a sleep tunic, and Wren watched something she had not expected to see on that dry, economized face: genuine surprise. He took in the ward slowly, the pinned guard still flat against the wall where Caro held him with nothing more than proximity and a lowered head, the second guard nursing a bandaged forearm, the overturned transfer crate, the emergency order glowing on Vash's slate held out for him to read. "This order authorizes reassignment under installation emergency provisions," Das said, reading it twice the way Vash had. "There was no installation emergency." "There was not," Vash said. "There was a hearing scheduled in 5 hours that Instructor Van appeared to believe he was going to lose." Das's slow blink came slower than usual. He looked at Caro, still immovable, still between the guards and the crate, still tracking every motion in the ward with flat ember eyes, and then at Wren, kneeling with a trembling hatchling pressed to her collarbone, and something in his calculus visibly shifted, the way ice shifts before it cracks all the way through. "Bring me Instructor Van," he said, "now, and bring the Penn ward's full behavioral logs on the animal designated Caro, not the summary Van submitted for the review. The full logs, every entry." The full logs took an hour to compile, and told a story Van had spent 11 years making sure no one read start to finish. 3 prior cadets had filed informal complaints about handling methods in the combat program, all 3 withdrawn within a week of filing, all 3 cadets transferred to unrelated postings shortly after. A feed weight log showing Caro held consistently below standard nutritional thresholds for 11 consecutive seasons, flagged twice by veterinary staff, and overruled both times by Van's authority as ranking beast discipline officer. A maintenance record for the control lance showing calibration settings above the regulation ceiling for pain response, adjusted, according to the timestamp, by Van himself 6 years prior and never returned to standard. Das read all of it standing in the ward doorway, Caro watching him the whole time with an attention that made the old Thren's dry-scaled hands, Wren noticed, go very still on the slate. 11 years, Das said finally, not to Wren, not to Vash, but seemingly to himself, or to some earlier version of himself that had signed off on annual reviews without ever once pulling the underlying feed logs. "I approved this program's continuation 3 times. I never once requested the full behavioral file." When Van arrived, escorted rather than summoned, he did not have his podium voice ready. Wren watched him take in the ward, Das standing in the doorway with the logs glowing in his hand, the pinned guard finally released and rubbing a bruised shoulder, the transfer crate lying empty and overturned in the straw, and watched the calculation he was so good at running simply fail to produce an answer this time. "Commandant Vash can confirm," Van started, "that emergency reassignment authority falls squarely within a ranking instructor's." "I have the logs, instructor." Das's voice had lost every trace of the dry patience it had carried in the corridor that morning. 11 years of feed weight suppression, a control instrument calibrated past regulation ceiling, 3 complaints filed, and 3 cadets quietly reassigned before they could be heard. And now an emergency order invoked at 4 hours before dawn, 5 hours before a scheduled review you had reason to believe you would lose, to remove the 2 organisms whose bond with a human handler was about to become the central evidence against everything you have built this program on for over a decade. He let the slate drop to his side. "I have overseen 11 Denkin claims in 40 years, Instructor Van, and dismissed every one of them, because I did not believe the bond you are describing was real. I no longer have that luxury. What I have instead is a war beast that took a shoulder check instead of a killing bite when it caught 2 of your men mid-abduction, at your order, of a cadet's registered cubs. Restraint your own combat program has never once documented it demonstrating toward anyone. I have a hatchling that stood its ground in an open yard against 600 pounds of its own species rather than run. And I have 11 years of falsified logs proving that whatever discipline you have spent a career claiming to represent, it was never anything more than cruelty with a rank attached to it." Van's mouth opened. Nothing came out of it that sounded like the man who had stood at that podium 6 days earlier, certain of every word. "You are relieved of your commission, effective immediately," Das said. "You will be escorted off this installation within the hour, and the record of this proceeding, the full record, instructor, logs included, will accompany you to whatever posting the Coalition Military Registry deems fit for an officer with your history. I do not imagine it will be a beast discipline posting again." He turned, robe settling around him, and for the first time addressed Wren directly, his voice not warm exactly, but no longer the voice of a man closing out a line item. "Cadet Talbot, the disposal order against your case animals is void, effective this moment, and will remain void. I will be filing this proceeding as the Coalition's 12th Denkin claim, and the first, in 40 years, that I am recommending be formally recognized." Behind her, Caro made a low sound that was not quite the watch rumble and not quite anything Wren had a name for yet, and settled its huge scarred head down onto the straw an arm's length from her knee, finally, fully, at rest. The weeks that followed changed the shape of Praxis Reach Academy in ways no charge sheet could have predicted. Caro was formally struck from the combat program's roster and reassigned, at Wren's request and Vash's signature, to general installation duty, which in practice meant it slept across her ward doorway every night and walked her to morning muster every day, a war beast the size of a supply cart padding along beside a 19-year-old cadet, while entire platoons of Thren officers in training pressed themselves flat against the corridor walls to let them pass. Ash grew visibly by the week, armor plate darkening from soft gray-green toward the deep iron color that marked a Duskwarden nearing its first true growth spurt, and had taken to sleeping curled directly against Caro's flank at night, the way Wren imagined a hatchling might have slept against an actual parent, in whatever version of this species' life had existed before the Academy decided runts weren't worth the feed. Fen, smallest of the 3 and least inclined to let anyone forget it, appointed himself sentry of the ward door and bid exactly one more cadet, a visiting supply officer who reached for Wren's shoulder without announcing himself first, before the entire installation simply learned, by consensus, to announce themselves. The cadets started calling the whole arrangement, with the same half-mocking reverence they'd used for the den watch, the full formation, the sight of Wren crossing the yard each morning with Caro at her hip, Ash trotting a half-step behind Caro's rear leg, and Fen riding her shoulder like he'd been carved there, all four of them moving as a single unhurried unit, while the rest of the academy rearranged its walking patterns around them without ever quite admitting that was what it was doing. Yasni found it endlessly amusing. "You have accidentally become the single most feared and most photographed cadet on this installation," she told Ren one evening, watching Ash attempt, with limited success, to mimic the deliberate care Ren used when braiding a length of spare cord into a lead for Fenn's harness. The hatchling's blunt claws entirely unsuited to the task, the effort entirely sincere. 3 cadets down the corridor had stopped to watch, the way people stopped now, at a respectful distance, whenever Ash tried something new. They have started calling it the cordwork discipline. As though you are running a covert combat curriculum out of a beast ward. It's a piece of string, yes, honey. It is a piece of string that a Duskwarden hatchling is treating as sacred instruction, in front of an audience, and I promise you that by next week half the junior cadets will have their own length of cord, and no idea why. She wasn't wrong. Within 10 days, Ren counted at least 6 cadets, human, sylph, 1 determinedly serious Corrigal, walking the yard with braided cord looped through their belt loops, an entire small superstition built out of nothing more than a girl teaching a lizard cub not to chew through her supply lines. Commandant Vash summoned her on the 11th day, and this time his office held a 3rd chair she hadn't seen before, and a visitor she had not expected. A Thren woman in the deep blue formal robe of the Coalition's outer diplomatic corps, silver thread at the collar denoting a rank Ren didn't recognize but understood, by the way Vash stood when she entered, to matter a great deal. "Envoy Sithra Ilhen," Vash said. "She has come from the Coalition Registry Office, ahead of a formal delegation, regarding Proctor General Das's Denkin recommendation. It is not every cycle a claim like this reaches the registry with a signature like Das's attached to it," Envoy Ilhen said, studying Ren with an interest that felt, for once, curious rather than clinical. "In 400 years, this Academy's registry has recorded exactly 2 prior Denkin bonds, neither confirmed by a witness of Das's standing, both from records too old to verify properly. If this is confirmed formally, Cadet Talbot, it will not simply clear your case animals for continued care. It will make this installation the site of the first fully verified Denkin recognition in 4 Coalition centuries. There will be a ceremony. There will be observers, senior officers from 3 sister academies, at minimum, and I would not be surprised if certain members of the registry board attend in person, given how long this claim has sat unconfirmed on paper only." She paused. "There will also, Cadet, be a great deal of attention on you and on your animals that I suspect neither of you has had to manage before. I want you to understand what you are agreeing to before the date is set." Ren thought of 6 months in a hidden loft, feeding 2 dying animals out of her own rations because no one else was going to. She thought of Van's smile in the proctor's hall, certain of an outcome that had never once belonged to him. "I understand," she said. "Set the date." 9 days, Ilhan said. "The Cordral Ridge Amphitheater, on the eastern flats. It is the only structure on this moon large enough to seat a delegation of that size. I will send the protocols for you to review. Caro, as the primary bonded animal, will be expected to stand for formal introduction before the assembled officers. I am told," and something almost like warmth crossed her formal composure, "that it does not object to crowds the way its file once suggested it would." "It doesn't mind crowds," Ren said. "It minds people it doesn't trust standing between it and something it's decided to protect. That's not the same thing." Envoy Ilhan looked at her for a long moment, the way Vash had looked at her in the yard 6 days after this all began, the look of someone recalculating, gently, everything they thought they'd understood about a subject before this particular subject walked into the room. "No," she agreed. "I don't imagine it is." The 9 days that followed were the busiest of Ren's life, and somewhere in the middle of them she stopped thinking of Ash and Finn and Caro as things she had to hide and started thinking of them, for the first time since the loft above Ward 9, as things she got to show people. Security for the amphitheater fell to the Academy's standing garrison. Supplemented. Vash mentioned this almost in passing, the way a man mentions a detail he has already stopped worrying about, by a coalition patrol cutter that would hold orbit through the ceremony window, standard procedure for any gathering that put senior officers from 4 installations in one open-air structure at once. Frontier space this far from the coalition core wasn't lawless exactly, but it wasn't crowded with warships either, and the sector had seen an uptick over the past year in what the security briefings dryly called opportunistic salvage activity. Raiders who struck isolated outposts for beast stock, fuel cells, anything with resale value, and vanished back into the debris fields before a response could scramble. Nobody expected trouble at a ceremony. Nobody ever did, Ren would think later, right up until the moment they did. Ash had its own kind of preparation to do. The hatchling had grown enough in the past weeks that its old harness no longer fit, and Ren spent 2 evenings adjusting a new one by hand, murmuring instructions it couldn't understand but seemed to listen to anyway, the way it listened to everything she said in that particular even tone. Fen, for his part, had decided the ceremony was an event requiring vigilance, and had taken to patrolling the ward's perimeter at odd hours, ears swiveling at every unfamiliar footstep, as though he'd already decided something about the size of the coming crowd made it worth extra caution. Ren noticed it. She filed it away without quite knowing, yet, that she should have paid it more attention. Caro's preparation was simpler and stranger. 3 days before the ceremony, unprompted, it began doing something none of the pen logs had ever recorded a Duskwarden doing, pacing the ward's outer wall at dusk, head low, nostrils working the evening air in slow, methodical sweeps, the same casting motion it had used the day it first caught ashes sent across the training yard. Ren watched it from the doorway one evening, Fen tense and alert on her shoulder, and felt the first cold thread of something she didn't have a word for yet settle into her stomach. "What is it?" she asked, quiet, the way she asked things of him now, not expecting an answer in words and getting one anyway in the set of his shoulders, the stiffness along his spine. "What are you smelling?" Caro didn't answer because he couldn't, not in any language she had. But he stopped pacing long enough to look at her, really look, the ember eyes steady and grave in a way she'd learned meant something specific, and then resumed his circuit of the wall with a purpose that hadn't been there 3 days earlier. She mentioned it to Vash the next morning. He listened, thanked her, and passed it along to the garrison security officer, who added an extra patrol rotation to the ceremony perimeter and considered the matter closed. Nobody on the moon, not Vash, not Das, not the patrol cutter's watch officer running routine scans of a quiet debris field 40,000 kilometers out, had any reason yet to connect an old war beast's restlessness to anything more specific than the general disruption of 9 days spent breaking every routine it had ever known. The morning of the ceremony came up clear and cold over the Cordral Ridge Flats, the amphitheater's tiered stone seating already filling by the time Ren arrived at the staging area with all 3 of her animals in tow, Caro ahead, Ash trotting the practiced half-step behind his rear leg, Fen riding her shoulder, still tense in a way that hadn't eased since the wall pacing 3 nights before. Officers from 3 sister academies filled the lower tiers, their uniforms a patchwork of every color the Coalition's member species wore into formal review. Envoy Ilhan stood near the central dais in her deep blue robe, conferring quietly with an aide. Proctor General Das occupied a place of honor near the front, dry-scaled and upright, the closest thing to anticipation Ren had yet seen cross that economized face. Commandant Vash stood at the dais itself, silver mane bound formally for the occasion, and beside him, Cole Hasker and Yesny Kaur had somehow secured places in the second tier, close enough that Ren caught Yesny's antennae lift in a small private wave as she crossed the amphitheater floor. It should have been, by every measure available to her, the best morning of Wren Talbot's short career at Praxis Reach Academy. Caro stopped dead 40 meters from the dais, head swinging up and out toward the eastern ridgeline, and made a sound Wren had never heard from him before. Not the watch rumble, not the saw-blade snarl he'd greeted the training yard with weeks earlier, but something higher, sharper, an alarm call with no ambiguity in it at all. 3 heartbeats later, the eastern sky lit up with the first breech flare of a raider dropship coming in low and fast over the ridge, and the ceremony that was supposed to make history for entirely different reasons became, instead, the second time in a month that Praxis Reach Academy watched Wren Talbot's small, strange pack decide something on that installation was worth dying to protect. Dropship! The shout came from the garrison line at the amphitheater's rim, a Corrigal sergeant already sprinting for the alarm relay. Unregistered vessel, breach pattern eastern ridge, all cadets to shelter now. The tiered seating that had been settling into orderly rose a moment before dissolved into motion, officers rising, aides pulling dignitaries toward the amphitheater's rear exits, the whole careful choreography of a formal ceremony collapsing into the much older choreography of people trying not to die. Wren felt the crowd's fear the way she'd learned to feel a room's temperature change around her animals. Instantly, before her mind had finished cataloging the cause, and did not run. She turned instead toward Caro, already coiled and forward-facing, and toward the eastern ridge where the dropship's engine glow was resolving into a shape. Low, matte-hulled, built for atmosphere entry and fast extraction, the kind of vessel that didn't waste tonnage on anything but cargo space and enough weapons to clear a landing zone. It put down hard on the flats below the ridge, kicking up a wall of dust, and disgorged raiders in mismatched armor before the ramp had finished lowering. 8 of them, maybe 10, moving with the loose, practiced speed of people who had done this before on installations with far less warning than this one had just gotten. "They're not here for the delegation," Vash's voice cut across the chaos, and Wren found him at her shoulder, already armed, already reading the raiders' formation with a soldier's eye instead of a commandant's. "Look at their approach vector. They're not moving toward the officers' section. They're moving toward the pens." He was right. Wren watched 2 of the raiders break off from the main group and angle hard toward the ward complex behind the amphitheater, toward the pens, toward every registered predator-class animal on the installation, toward, she understood with a lurch that had nothing to do with fear for herself, the single most valuable, single most talked-about pair of case animals on this or any frontier moon in the sector. A Denkin bond confirmed by a Proctor General's own signature wasn't just a diplomatic curiosity. On a black market that paid well for rare bonded predators, it was a price tag with legs, and word of a ceremony 9 days in the planning had clearly traveled further, and to worse ears, than anyone on that installation had accounted for. "Ash," Wren said, and didn't need to say more. Fen was already off her shoulder, streaking low across the amphitheater floor toward the ward complex ahead of the 2 raiders, faster over open ground than anything his size had any right to be. Caro broke into a dead run a half-second behind him, and Wren ran too, ceremony robes and formal protocols forgotten, chasing her own pack toward the one place on this installation the raiders had correctly guessed was worth the risk. She reached the ward complex 40 seconds behind Caro and found the scene already resolving into something out of a nightmare she hadn't known to have. 1 raider lay flat in the dirt outside the ward door, Fen planted on his chest with fangs bared an inch from his throat, the kit's entire trembling body, a coiled promise of what came next if the man so much as breathed wrong. The second raider had gotten the ward door half open, capture pole already extended toward the corner where Ash had bolted in fear at the first sound of breach, and Caro hit him from the side with the full weight of a dead run, driving him through the doorframe and into the ward's straw floor with a crash that shook dust from the rafters. This time there was no restraint in it. Wren understood that too, arriving breathless in the doorway, watching Caro plant one massive forefoot on the raider's chest and lower his head until the man's whole field of vision was nothing but ember eyes and old scarring, and 11 years of exactly the kind of controlled violence this species had been bred, generation after generation, to deliver on command. The raider didn't move. He didn't so much as blink harder than he had to. "Caro," Wren's voice, steady despite everything, cut through the ward. "Hold him, don't kill him, we need him breathing." The foot on the man's chest didn't lift, but the pressure eased, fractionally, exactly as much as her voice asked for, and not one measure more. Behind her, in the main amphitheater, the sound of real fighting had begun. The flat crack of the garrison's rifles. A raider's shout cut short. The deeper concussive thud of the patrol cutter's descent thrusters as it broke orbit and came down hard and fast over the ridge. 40,000 kilometers of quiet debris field patrol collapsing in under 2 minutes into the exact kind of response the security briefings had insisted, 9 days ago, that nobody would need. Wren left Fenn and Caro holding their 2 raiders and ran back toward the amphitheater, because the ward was secure now and the rest of her academy wasn't. And somewhere in the smoke and scattering crowd, Yesenia and Cole had been sitting in the second tier when the dropship's flare had lit the ridge. She found the main fight already turning, but not finished. The garrison line had formed a ragged perimeter around the dais where Envoy Ilhin, Commandant Vash, and Proctor General Das were making a slow, covered retreat toward the amphitheater's rear tunnel, a Corrigal sergeant laying down cover fire from a collapsed section of tiered stone. 2 raiders had broken past the garrison's flank entirely and were cutting straight across the seating tiers, not toward the dais, Wren realized with her heart going cold, but toward the second tier, toward the knot of junior cadets still tangled in the crush of people trying to reach the exits, toward Yesenia, whose species could outthink almost anyone on that installation, but could not, in a dead sprint across open stone, outrun a grown human, let alone an armed raider. Ash reached them first. Wren would turn the memory over for years afterward, trying to understand how a hatchling barely passed its first growth spurt, alone, separated from Caro, terrified enough to have bolted for a corner 20 minutes earlier, had instead put itself between an armed raider and a Sylph cadet it had known for exactly the length of 6 evenings' worth of scrap meat deliveries. But there it was, small and trembling and utterly immovable, planted in the raider's path with every unfinished armor plate along its spine raised, making a sound that had no business coming out of something that size. The same structured, rhythmic call it had used in the training yard weeks before, except sharper now, edged with something that hadn't been there the first time. Something that sounded, if Wren let herself hear it plainly, exactly like a threat. The raider didn't slow. He was bigger than the hatchling by a factor Wren didn't want to calculate, armored, armed, moving at a dead run with a capture pole already swinging down toward the smaller target directly. And for one suspended half-second Wren understood with total clarity that she was too far away to reach either of them in time. Caro was not too far away. He came off the ward complex's outer wall at a dead sprint, cutting the distance in a handful of strides that shouldn't have been physically possible for something his mass, and hit the raider from the flank with the same crushing weight he'd used on the man in the ward doorway. Except this time, there was nothing measured in it at all, because this time it wasn't Wren standing in the path of the danger. It was the small trembling thing that had learned to sleep against his flank every night for weeks. And 11 years of controlled violence had exactly 1 gear left when that particular calculation was on the table. The raider went down hard and did not get back up under his own power. Caro stood over him for one long beat, chest heaving, and then turned immediately, completely, to nose at Ash, checking the hatchling over with a frantic, wordless thoroughness that had nothing predatory left in it at all. The second raider, seeing his partner go down, made the only rational choice left to him and ran for the dropship. He didn't make it. The patrol cutter's ground team, finally down and deployed, cut him off at the tree line with the flat efficiency of people who did this for a living, and within 90 more seconds the fight that had scattered a formal coalition ceremony across the Cordral Ridge Flats was, as suddenly as it had begun, over. Wren reached Ash and Caro at a dead run of her own, dropped to her knees in the trampled grass, and got both arms around the hatchling before she'd fully registered that her own hands were shaking harder than anything else on that field. Ash pressed its narrow skull hard into her collarbone, still trembling, still making small distressed sounds against her throat, and Caro lowered his massive head to rest against her shoulder from the other side, close enough that she could feel his heartbeat, still hammering, gradually slow to match the rhythm of her own breathing the way it had learned, somehow, over 6 strange weeks, to do. "You didn't have to do that," she said into Ash's scales, voice cracking on the last word. "You could have stayed hidden. You could have stayed safe." Ash didn't answer because Ash never answered in words, but the hatchling pressed closer instead of pulling back, and Wren understood, the way she'd come to understand nearly everything about this strange, borrowed, entirely undeserved family of hers, that safety had never once been the calculation it was making. Across the field, Yesney Kaur sat where she'd fallen in the scramble, antennae rigid, one hand pressed flat to her own chest in a gesture Wren had never seen her species make before and would learn later was the Sylph equivalent of a held breath finally released. She looked at Ash. She looked at Wren. She did not say anything at all and didn't need to. 6 weeks earlier, that same hatchling had been the smallest of 4 in a cull crate behind Ward 9, breathing where its siblings had stopped. It took the better part of an hour to account for everyone, treat the wounded 3 garrison cadets with burns from a Raider stun charge, none of them serious, and 1 Thren officer with a broken wrist from the scramble off the collapsed tier, and secure the 4 Raiders taken alive, 2 of them still shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the cold morning air, and everything to do with having spent the last conscious minutes of their lives pinned under a war beast's forefoot. The patrol cutter's intelligence officer, a clipped, efficient corrigal named Fane, pulled Wren aside once the perimeter had gone quiet, data slate already filling with transcript. "We ran preliminary questioning on the 2 your animals held," she said. "Wanted you to hear this before the official report circulates, given it concerns you directly." She turned the slate so Wren could see the translated interrogation summary. "They weren't opportunists who happened across a ceremony, Cadet. They'd had this installation flagged for 3 weeks, ever since word of an unconfirmed Denkin claim started moving through frontier trade channels. There's a market, out past the registry's reach, for verified bonded predator-class animals, not for combat use, for display. Private collectors, mostly, on worlds far enough from coalition oversight that nobody asks where the animal came from, or what happened to the person it used to answer to." She let that sit a moment. "They came here today specifically because your ceremony told every trafficker in 3 sectors, in advance, exactly when and where to find the single rarest confirmed bond in 400 years, gathered in one open field with minimal security. You weren't collateral damage this morning, Cadet Talbot. You were the target. All 3 of them." Wren looked down at Ash, still pressed against her side, and at Caro, standing close enough that his flank brushed her shoulder, and understood, with a coldness that took longer to pass than the fight itself had, exactly how close this morning had come to costing her everything the last 6 weeks had built. "He knew," she said quietly. "Caro, 3 nights before the ceremony, he started pacing the ward wall at dusk, scenting the air. I told the commandant. Nobody connected it to anything specific because there wasn't anything specific to connect it to yet." "There will be a note in the record about that," Fane said, not unkindly. "For what it's worth, Cadet, most installations this size don't get 3 days warning from anything, biological or otherwise. You got lucky that the animal doing the warning happened to already be paying attention to a threat nobody else on this moon had cause to notice yet." "It's not luck," Wren said, and didn't elaborate, because she didn't think Fane, efficient and clipped and already 3 tasks ahead in her own head, needed the whole explanation, that a species which raised its young by asking one simple question, who stays, had spent 11 years learning exactly how much attention a threat to something worth staying for deserved, and had simply never had anything worth that attention until 6 weeks ago. Proctor General Das found her an hour later, once the field had been cleared and the delegation's shaken officers had reassembled, at a respectful distance now, along the amphitheater's undamaged southern tier. He looked older than he had that morning, Wren thought, though it might only have been the dust still clinging to his formal robe. "I have overseen 11 Denkin claims in 40 years, he said, without preamble, the way he seemed to say everything. "I dismissed all 11. I told you in a corridor 9 days ago that I expected this to be the 12th dismissal of my career." He looked past her, toward Caro standing sentinel over Ash, toward Fenn, returned now from the ward, curled watchful and unusually subdued in the crook of Wren's arm. "I no longer believe that. I do not think I believed it after the first incident, if I am honest with myself, though I told myself otherwise for the sake of procedure. I am certain of nothing else after this morning." "What happens to the ceremony now, sir?" "We hold it," Das said, "this afternoon, once the field is cleared and the delegation has had time to stop shaking. I have already amended the recommendation I intend to file. It will no longer read as a routine Denkin confirmation." His dry-scaled mouth did something that, on a less controlled face, might have been the beginning of a smile. "It will read, Cadet Talbot, as a formal commendation. The first joint Denkin recognition and Combat Distinguished Service citation this registry has ever issued to a bonded pair in the same proceeding. I do not know that the paperwork format even exists yet. I intend to have someone invent it by this afternoon." They held the ceremony that afternoon, on a field still faintly scarred with dropship scorch marks, and the churned dirt of that morning's fighting, and Wren would remember, more than anything said from the dais, the particular quality of silence that fell over the reassembled delegation the moment she crossed the amphitheater floor with all 3 of her animals arranged around her exactly as they'd been arranged that morning, before everything. When this had still been meant to be a simple confirmation of paperwork. Caro walked ahead and to her left, the scarring along his flank visible in the afternoon light, moving with the unhurried, watchful gait of something that had spent the morning deciding, twice, that this particular gathering of officers was under his protection, and had not yet fully stood down from that decision. Ash walked its practiced half-step behind his rear leg, armor darkening week by week toward the deep iron color of an adult, close enough now in size to a fully grown hound that several of the visiting officers from the sister academies, who had heard the story second-hand over the lunch recess and disbelieved most of it, visibly reassessed their skepticism in real time. Fenn rode her shoulder, tail curled loose and alert, watching the crowd the way he'd watched it since the wall pacing began 3 nights before the attack, still working, Wren suspected, through exactly how much of this new caution was going to become permanent. Envoy Ilhan met her at the base of the dais rather than waiting atop it, which Wren understood, even before Ilhan spoke, as its own kind of honor. "I have revised the protocol twice since this morning," Ilhan said, quiet enough that only Wren could hear it. "Once for the attack, once because Proctor General Das insisted, and I no longer have any grounds to argue with him, that the standard Denkin recognition script does not adequately describe what this installation witnessed today. So we are improvising, Cadet. I hope you'll forgive an occasion that does not go entirely to plan." "It's fine," Wren said. "Nothing about this has gone to plan since the loft above Ward 9. Something that might have been the ghost of a laugh crossed Ilhan's formal composure, there and gone, and then she turned to face the assembled delegation and raised her voice to carry across the amphitheater's tiered stone. "Officers of the Coalition," she said, 400 years ago, Our ancestors recorded a bond between handler and beast that asked nothing of strength, nothing of species, nothing of rank. A bond earned only through the unglamorous, unwitnessed labor of staying through a season no one else believed worth staying through. In 4 centuries since, we have recorded exactly 2 claims to that bond, and confirmed neither with certainty. Today, before this delegation, in the presence of a Proctor General with 40 years of service and 11 prior dismissals to his name, we confirm the third, and we do so having watched it demonstrated not once this cycle, but twice, the second time under fire, in defense not only of its own bonded handler, but of every officer and cadet on this field. She turned to Wren. Cadet Wren Talbot of Earth, step forward. Wren stepped forward. Caro moved with her, close at her shoulder, and neither Ash nor Finn broke position. The 4 of them crossing the last few meters to the dais as the single unhurried unit the cadets back home had started calling the full formation. Except now 400 officers from across the coalition were watching it happen instead of 40 cadets on a Tuesday afternoon. By the authority vested in this registry, Ilhan said, and by the witness testimony of Proctor General Farron Das, Commandant Rurik Vash, and this field's entire assembled delegation, I confirm the Denkin bond between Cadet Wren Talbot and the Duskwarden-designated Caro, and extend recognition to the bonded pack under her care, the hatchling Ash and the Vorlinks Fen, as a fully sanctioned den unit under coalition law, protected from disposal, reassignment, or separation by any installation authority in perpetuity. She paused, and when she continued, her formal cadence gave way just slightly to something rower. And on behalf of this delegation, I extend the coalition's gratitude for a defense this morning that most of us, myself included, are only alive to formally acknowledge, because a hatchling refused to run, a war beast refused to hold back, and a 19-year-old cadet from a species we have spent 11 years treating as too soft for anything that mattered stood her ground in an open field twice, when every institutional incentive told her to step back. The applause that followed was not the polite, measured applause of a diplomatic proceeding. It went on long enough that Caro's ears flattened at the volume of it, long enough that Ash pressed closer against Wren's leg, uncertain what to make of a crowd making noise that wasn't a threat, and Wren stood at the center of it with one hand on Caro's scarred flank and the other steadying Finn's tail where it had begun, despite everything, to lash with something that looked almost like pride. Somewhere in the crowd, she caught Yesine's eye, and Cole's, and even near the back, arms crossed, expression unreadable but no longer mocking Osek Rin's, and understood that whatever Praxis Reach Academy had been before that Tuesday afternoon in the Proctor's Hall, it was not going to be that installation again. Envoy Ilhan asked if she wanted to say anything to the delegation before the proceeding closed, and Wren almost said no, the way she'd said no to every spotlight that had ever found her in 19 years of learning to be useful without being noticed. But Caro's flank was warm and steady under her hand, and Ash had finally stopped trembling against her leg, and Finn's tail had settled into the slow, satisfied sweep he only used when he decided, for the moment, that everything worth guarding was already accounted for, and something in her decided the silence had earned a different answer this time. "I didn't do anything heroic 6 weeks ago," she said, and her voice carried further across the amphitheater than she expected it to, flat and plain and unpracticed. "I found an animal dying in a crate and I didn't put it back. I found another one drowning and I dried it off. That's the whole story. Nobody trained me for it. Nobody thought I was capable of anything more than mucking out pens, and for a long time I believed them, because it's easier to believe a room full of people than to believe yourself." She looked down at Caro, at the old scarring along his flank, at 11 years of exactly the kind of neglect that had once been called discipline. "The only thing I ever did differently than anyone else on this installation is I stayed. That's not bravery. It's just the one thing nobody bothered to try first." She paused. "They stayed too when it counted, twice. I'd like the record to reflect that whatever gets called brave here today, it was theirs before it was ever mine." Caro made a low sound at that, not the watch rumble, not the alarm call, something Wren had only heard once before, in the ward the night the guards came, a sound with no clean translation but that she'd come, over 6 strange weeks, to understand as approval, as agreement, as the closest thing his species had to a nod. The applause that followed was quieter than the first round had been, and lasted longer, and Wren understood, watching it move through the tiers, that it was landing differently now. Not for a spectacle, but for a sentence, the kind 400 officers from a dozen worlds would carry home and repeat, in their own words, to cadets who needed to hear it. News of instructor Dreeth Van's fate reached her 3 weeks later, second-hand, in a registry bulletin Yeseni forwarded without comment. He had been stripped of rank and commission, as Das promised, and reassigned not to another beast discipline posting, which the bulletin noted had been formally closed to him for life, but to a supply depot on a coalition outpost 3 systems out, a menial rotation processing inventory manifests for a garrison too small to need a full-time officer of any kind. It was, Wren understood reading it, precisely the kind of posting he had once decided human cadets deserved by default, unglamorous, unwitnessed, beneath the notice of anyone who mattered. She felt, reading it, less satisfaction than she expected to, and more of something quieter. The simple, settled knowledge that a man who built a career on deciding who was too soft to matter had finally discovered, from the inside, exactly how that verdict felt. She didn't think about him again after that. There wasn't room. The weeks that followed the ceremony filled themselves faster than she could have predicted, with requests from 3 sister academies for consultation on beast discipline reform, with a formal offer, which she accepted, after 2 long conversations with Vash and 1 longer one with herself, to remain at Praxis Reach past her cadet rotation as the installation's first Denkin liaison instructor. A title envoy Ilhan admitted to inventing on the spot, but which the registry had since made permanent across 4 frontier academies. With Ash, now taller at the shoulder than most Thren cadets, still sleeping curled against Caro's flank most nights out of habit rather than need. With Fen, who had never quite stopped patrolling the ward's perimeter at dusk, and never would, and whom Wren had long since stopped trying to talk out of it. The new intake arrived at Praxis Reach 2 months after the ceremony, 40 raw cadets fresh off the transport shuttle, and among them, for the first time since Wren's own arrival, a second human, a thin, quiet girl named Petra Voss who kept her eyes on the ground during muster and flinched, almost invisibly, every time an instructor's voice sharpened near her. Wren recognized the flinch. She'd worn it herself for the better part of a year. She didn't approach Petra directly, some lessons she'd learned, only stuck if a person arrived at them on their own feet, but she made sure her rotation through the beast wards overlapped with the new intake's orientation tour, and made sure Caro was visible, unhurried, sprawled across the ward doorway in a patch of afternoon sun the way he liked to be when nothing on the installation currently required his attention. Ash, well past the size now where anyone mistook it for harmless, lay curled against his flank. Fen, characteristically, was somewhere up in the rafters, watching the new arrivals the way he watched everyone, with the flat, unhurried suspicion of something that had learned trust was earned and never assumed. The tour instructor, a brisk Corrigal Wren didn't know well, gestured at the scene with the particular pride of someone showing off an installation's crown jewel to visitors. This is the ward of Instructor Talbot's Denkin pack, Duskwarden, Hatchling, and Vorlinks, all 3 formally recognized under Coalition registry law. You'll see them across the installation regularly. They have full clearance. A pause, a smile Wren recognized as performative rather than sincere. It's quite a story, for those of you who haven't heard it. Cadet found a dying hatchling in a cull crate 2 rotations back. Everyone told her it wasn't worth saving. She saved it anyway. Petra Voss, at the back of the intake group, looked up from the ground for the first time since muster and looked, very deliberately, at Wren instead of at the animals. 3 days later, Wren found her outside Ward 11 after curfew, sitting on an overturned crate in the dark, a scrawny grelling kit, a species Wren didn't know well, something small and quilled and native to this moon's northern flats, used sparingly in the Academy's tracking program, cupped in both hands against her chest. "It's the runt," Petra said without looking up, before Wren had said a word. "Pen Master's doing the cull sort tomorrow morning. I heard him say it wasn't going to make the tracking program's minimum weight." Her hands tightened very slightly around the small trembling shape. "I know I'm not supposed to be out here. I know what happens if someone finds out I took it. She stopped, started again. "I don't know what I'm doing. I don't have 6 months of ration credits to spare, and I don't have a hidden loft, and I don't have anyone who'll pretend they didn't see anything." Wren sat down on the crate beside her, slow and unhurried, the way she'd learned to move around anything frightened. "You have one thing I didn't have," she said. "You have someone standing right here who already did this once and is still standing." She looked down at the trembling kit, then at Petra's white-knuckled hands. "I'm not going to do this for you. That's not what tonight is. But I'll walk you through what worked and what nearly got both of us killed, and I know a Sylph cadet who owes me a favor in scrap meat, and there's a heat coil in the back of my own Ward Nobody's inventoried in 2 months. She held Petra's eyes, the way Yesenia had once held hers, 6 months and a lifetime ago. "You understand what you're agreeing to?" "I understand it. And you're doing it anyway." Petra Voss looked down at the small, trembling animal in her hands, the one every institutional incentive on this moon had already decided wasn't worth the feed, and said the same 3 words Wren had said to Yesenia Kaur on a night that felt now like it belonged to someone else's life entirely. "Somebody has to." Wren felt something settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the cold night air, the particular, quiet satisfaction of watching a thing she'd built alone, out of stubbornness and stolen rations and no institutional support at all, become something that no longer needed her to exist. She reached out and rested one hand, briefly, on Petra's shoulder, the smallest gesture, and felt the girl's flinch. The same flinch Wren had carried into this academy a year before her, ease, just slightly, for the first time since the shuttle ramp had lowered 3 days earlier. Behind them, from the direction of the ward, Caro's low watch rumble carried across the dark yard, steady and unbothered, the sound of something that had already decided, the moment it caught the new kit's scent on the wind, that whatever this was, it fell within the perimeter it had sworn itself to. The kit's name turned out to be Bramble. Once Petra worked up the nerve to name him out loud instead of just in the privacy of her own head, and the pen master found out about him inside of 9 days, faster than Ash and Fenn's discovery had taken, mostly because Petra, unlike Wren at the start, hadn't had 6 months of practice secrecy to fall back on, and partly because Caro had taken to walking Petra's rotation route with an unsubtlety that made the whole ward smell, within a week, unmistakably, of Denkin business. But the pen master who found Bramble curled in a nest of stolen straw was not the same installation Van had once run discipline for. He looked at the kit, looked at the new instructor standing in the doorway with a duskwarden the size of a supply cart at her shoulder, and made a call that would have been unthinkable 8 months earlier. He logged Bramble as a provisional Denkin candidate under Instructor Talbot's supervision, filed the paperwork himself before anyone above him could object, and told Petra, gruffly, that she'd want a proper harness fitted before the kit doubled in size, because grellings grew fast once they stopped starving. "That's it?" Petra asked Wren afterward, disbelieving, Bramble already asleep against her collarbone in a posture that mirrored almost exactly the way Ash had once slept against Wren's own. No hearing, no charge sheet. "That's it," Wren said. There used to be a whole ceremony of misery built around a decision that should have taken 30 seconds. It took someone standing in a proctor's hall, refusing to put a cub down before anyone figured out the ceremony was the problem, not the cub. Word of the pen master's ruling reached Vash's office within the hour, and rather than the summons Wren half expected, she received instead a short note, delivered by an aide, that read only, "Denkin Provision, second case filed and approved. Good instincts, instructor, keep them." She kept the note. She still had it, folded small, in the bottom of a footlocker 2 years later, long after the paper itself had gone soft at the creases. The invitation to Faro Hollow Academy came the following season, forwarded through Envoy Ilhan's office with a note attached, explaining that a sister installation 3 Systems Core Ward was managing what the note delicately called a legacy discipline structure resistant to reform, and would benefit from a consultation visit by the Coalition's only serving Denkin liaison instructor. Wren went, with Caro and Ash both. Finn stayed behind at Petra's insistence, ostensibly to help settle Bramble's harness training, though Wren suspected the real reason was that Finn had never fully forgiven any installation that wasn't Praxis Reach for existing. Faro Hollow's beast discipline officer was a stiff, silver-scaled Thren named Kessel Dre, and he did not bother disguising his opinion of the visit. "I have read the registry bulletin on your case, Instructor Talbot," he said, over a cup of something bitter in his office. Caro settled watchful in the doorway behind her because Caro no longer settled anywhere he couldn't see the exits. "A moving story, genuinely. But this installation has run its combat program on strict conditioning standards for 40 years without a single Denkin claim. And I confess, I am not eager to overhaul 4 decades of proven discipline on the strength of one exceptional cadet's exceptional luck." "It wasn't luck," Wren said, the way she'd said it to a Corrigal intelligence officer on a scorched field a season earlier, the way she suspected she'd keep saying it in one form or another for the rest of her career. "I'd like to see your cull logs, Instructor Dre, not the summary. The full logs, if you don't mind. I find summaries tend to leave out the parts that matter." He didn't want to show her. She watched him decide not to want to, and watched him do it anyway, because Envoy Ilhan's forwarding note had carried enough weight to make refusal awkward, and because, she suspected, watching his jaw tighten as the data scrolled, some small stubborn part of him already knew, before he'd finished pulling the file, exactly what kind of numbers 11 of his 40 years were going to show. She found 3 cull crate cases in the first quarter alone that matched the shape of Ash's story almost exactly, undersized hatchlings from a bad clutch, marked for disposal on a schedule, no exception process, no review. She didn't lecture Kessel Dre about any of it. She simply set the numbers in front of him, the way DOS's full logs had once been set in front of a room that could no longer pretend not to see them, and let the numbers do what numbers did better than any speech she could have given. Faro Hollow filed its first provisional Denkin case 11 days after she left. It was not the last sister academy to send for her that year. The request that came from Kessel Dre himself, 4 months later, was the one Wren least expected and, in the end, could least afford to refuse. It arrived not as a formal consultation invitation, but as a priority relay, flagged urgent, routed through Envoy Ilhan's office because Dre hadn't yet earned the standing to reach Wren's desk directly and knew it. A frontier convoy running the same trade lanes Cole's supply cutter serviced, 3 homesteader transports and a livestock hauler, families relocating to a new settlement grant out past Faro Hollow's patrol range, had gone dark 2 days into a run that should have taken 6 hours. The convoy's last transmission, garbled and cut short, had mentioned an unregistered vessel matching the profile of the trafficking network the patrol cutter's intelligence officer had traced back to the raid on Praxis Reach. Dre's academy had beast-handling cadets and combat-trained escorts. What it didn't have, he admitted in the relay with the particular discomfort of a man eating a large helping of his own former certainty, was anything that had ever proven it could talk: a captured, panicked, half-feral animal down from violence without simply killing it. And initial scans suggested the convoy's escort had been traveling with 3 young sanctuary-bound predators being relocated for the settlement's stock guardian program. Animals that would be worse than useless in a firefight if they broke and ran, and lethal to their own rescuers if they didn't. Wren took Caro and left within the hour. On a fast courier, the patrol cutter diverted specifically for the run. Ash and Finn left behind under Petra's care, with an instruction that amounted to hold the ward, and don't let anyone talk you out of the harder decisions while I'm gone. She hadn't traveled anywhere significant without at least one of her animals since the loft above Ward 9, and the 11 hours of transit alone with nothing but Caro's steady presence across the courier's narrow hold felt, for the first time in years, like the old fear finding room to breathe again. They found the convoy grounded on a scrub plain 40 kilometers off its filed route. The livestock hauler's hull scored black along one flank. 2 of the homesteader transports overturned in the dirt, where something had hit them hard enough to flip 11-ton vehicles onto their sides. The raiders themselves were gone, driven off. Wren learned from the convoy's shaking escort captain, by the settlement's stock guardian animals. 3 young terror hounds not yet a year past weaning, bred for guarding livestock rather than fighting armed raiders, and thrown into exactly that fight anyway when the attack came. 2 of the 3 had gone to ground somewhere in the scrub, feral with panic, unreachable by anyone in the escort who'd tried. The 3rd stood over the body of a homesteader's child, alive. Wren saw with a lurch of relief that nearly buckled her knees. Unconscious and bleeding from a scalp wound but breathing, snarling at anyone who came within 20 meters, having apparently decided in the chaos that the entire species responsible for its own frightened flight through the scrub could not be trusted near the one small human it had chosen, mid-panic, to stand over instead of abandon. "We can't get close enough to treat her," the escort captain said, hoarse, hands shaking on his own weapon. "Every time someone tries, it goes for them. We don't want to kill it. It saved her. We just don't know how to get past it without hurting someone." Wren left her own weapon with the captain and walked into the open scrub with Caro at her side. Slow, deliberate, the way she'd learned to move around anything frightened since a night 11 years into another animal's neglect had taught her exactly what fear looked like from the inside. The terror hound was smaller than Caro by half, rangy and short-coated where Caro was armored and broad, but it had the same wild, cornered light in its eyes that Wren remembered from a training yard years earlier. Not malice, never malice, just an animal that had run out of any calculation except the one that said everything approaching was a threat until proven otherwise. Caro slowed his own approach without being asked, dropping his head low, and made a sound Wren had heard from him only rarely. Not the watch rumble, not the alarm call, something softer, almost a chuff, pitched low enough that only an animal this close could have registered it at all. An offering, not a challenge. The terror hound's snarl faltered. Wren knelt in the dirt a body's length away, hands open and empty, and did the only thing she knew how to do that had ever worked on an animal too far gone in its own fear to hear reason. She stayed still, and she waited, and she let the waiting say what words couldn't. It took the better part of 20 minutes. The terror hound circled twice, snarled once more, half-hearted and finally exhausted. Wren understood, more than convinced. Worn down by adrenaline it had no framework left to sustain, lay down beside the child it had guarded and let its head drop onto crossed forepaws, eyes never leaving Wren's hands but no longer defending the ground between them. She moved slow, checked the child's pulse, found it steady, and signaled the medics forward with a flat palm rather than a shout, the terror hound's ears flicking at the sound of approaching boots but its body staying down, watching, allowing. The other 2 took another 2 hours to find, deeper in the scrub, and came in easier once the first was recovered and calm. Pack animals, Wren would explain to Dre later, taking their cue from whichever member of the group settled first. the same principle that had once sent Fenn's hackles down at the sound of her voice in a chaos he had no other framework to survive. By the time the convoy's medical shuttle arrived to airlift the wounded, all 3 terror hounds had been resecured, the child was stable, and Kessel Dre's academy had a second field report to add to the first, this one bearing no Denkin claim of Wren's own at all. Just 3 young animals nobody else on that scrub plane had known how to reach, and a girl who'd learned, a long time ago in a hidden loft, that reaching them was never about strength to begin with. "I owe you an apology I don't know how to phrase adequately," Dre told her, over the same bitter drink in the same stiff office. 4 days later, once the convoy's survivors had been resettled and the report filed. "I spent our first meeting certain that what happened at Praxis Reach was luck dressed up as method. I have now watched you walk into an active threat zone with nothing but patience and talk 3 separate panic predators out of a fight none of my trained cadets could reach. That is not luck, Instructor Talbot. I am no longer capable of pretending otherwise, and I find I no longer wish to." "You don't owe me an apology," Wren said. "You owe those 3 terror hounds a proper stock guardian program that doesn't throw yearlings into a raider firefight with no backup plan for what happens after. Fix that, and we're even." Dre fixed it within the season. It was, by then, simply the kind of thing installations did once Wren Talbot had been through them. Not because she demanded it, but because the numbers, once someone finally looked at them honestly, rarely left much room to do anything else. By the time Wren's original cadet class reached its graduation season, Ash stood taller at the shoulder than Caro, a fact that startled every new intake who hadn't grown up alongside the hatchling's slow, relentless climb toward its full adult size, and startled Wren herself less than she expected some mornings, watching the 2 Duskwardens cross the yard together, the younger one's stride finally longer than the elder's. The elder one's watchfulness no less absolute for having a second set of eyes to share the work with now. Fenn had stopped growing months earlier, Vorlynxes reaching their full size faster than either of the reptilian pair, but had lost none of the outsized ferocity that made new cadets, every intake, learn within a week to announce themselves at the ward door. Cole Hasker graduated into a logistics posting on a supply cutter running the frontier trade lanes, and came by the ward the morning before his transport left, awkward in his departure uniform, to press one last care package of stolen infirmary bandages into Wren's hands, for old time's sake, and to let Fenn, who had never fully stopped treating him as provisionally acceptable rather than fully trusted, sniff his boots one final time before declaring, with a single dismissive flick of his tail, that Cole Hasker was, after 2 years, finally allowed all the way in. Yesney Kaur stayed on at Praxis Reach as a junior instructor in the Sylph liaison office, close enough that she still brought scrap meat by twice a week out of habit rather than obligation, and close enough that, when the Academy formally established its first cross-species Denkin curriculum, built, in no small part, on the field notes Wren had compiled from 2 years of consultation visits and 1 very long season of Pharaoh Hollow's begrudging cull log reform, it was Yesney who co-authored it. Antennae swiveling through the drafting sessions in the slow figure eight of someone doing math she was, for once, glad to have the answer to. Petra Voss graduated a full class behind Wren's own, Bramble grown into a sleek, sharp-eyed grelling nearly the size of a hunting hound, and stood for her own Denkin confirmation in the same Cordral Ridge amphitheater, where Wren's had nearly ended in gunfire 2 years earlier, this time under security tight enough that nothing broke the proceeding at all, this time with Wren standing in the officers' section rather than the center of the field. Watching a girl who had once flinched at a raised voice stand calm and steady, while an envoy read her name into the registry. The Academy itself had changed in ways that went beyond any single ceremony. The cull crate behind Ward 9 had been decommissioned entirely, replaced by a review process that took 30 minutes instead of a cadet's entire secret, sleepless year. The Den Watch had become, officially now rather than half-mockingly, a recognized rotation, off-duty cadets who wanted to earn a place near a bonded PAX ward, vetted and welcomed. The way Osek Rin had once earned his place with a strip of dried meat and an unpracticed, stubborn care he never fully explained to anyone. Cordwork discipline had somehow, absurdly, become an actual optional handling skills elective, taught twice a season, with a waiting list. And on a bright morning 18 months after the Proctor's Hall, Wren Talbot walked into a first-year orientation classroom with two full-grown Duskwardens flanking her, and a Vorlynx riding her shoulder, exactly the way she'd once walked into that same room as a defendant. And the room went silent the way a room goes silent right before someone learns something that changes how they see everything after it. "This is Instructor Talbot," the orientation officer said, to 40 new faces that included, this cycle, 6 human cadets instead of 1, Earth's coalition standing quietly, steadily improved by 2 years of a registry bulletin nobody in the sector had stopped talking about. "She'll be running your beast discipline fundamentals this rotation. I'd advise you to listen closely." She wrote most of the current curriculum herself. Wren looked out at 40 nervous faces, most of them the age she'd been the night she found a dying hatchling in a crate behind Ward 9, and felt Carol's flank settle warm against her side, and Ash's steady breathing at her other shoulder, and Fenn's tail curl loose and content around the back of her neck, and thought not for the first time, but with a clarity that had taken 2 years and one very long field of raider fire to fully earn, that this was not, in the end, a story about a war beast, or a hatchling, or a kit, or even about the particular species of loyalty that ran through all 3 of them. It was a story about staying. That was the whole of it and had been from the start. She didn't lecture that first morning. She'd learned, over 18 months of consultation, visits to installations far less willing to change than Praxis Reach had become, that lectures rarely moved anyone who hadn't already decided to be moved. Instead, she had the new intake sit in a loose circle on the classroom floor, and let Ash and Caro move among them at their own unhurried pace, and watched 40 nervous cadets discover, one at a time, the particular vertigo of having 600 pounds of armored predator sniff carefully at an outstretched hand, and decide, on its own terms, whether that hand belonged to someone worth acknowledging. A Thren cadet near the back, young, stiff-backed, clearly raised on the same disciplined doctrine that had once trained Van, flinched hard when Caro's head swung toward him, and Wren watched him catch himself immediately after, ashamed of the flinch, the way every cadet on this moon had once been taught that fear was a failure rather than information. "Don't apologize for that," Wren said before he could. "Every animal in this room can smell fear before you've finished feeling it. Pretending you don't have it doesn't fool them, it just means they can't trust what you're actually telling them. Caro doesn't need you fearless, he needs you honest." She nodded toward the cadet's hand, still half raised, half retracted. "Try again. Let him smell the truth this time, instead of the performance." The cadet steadied his hand. Caro, patient in a way 11 years of neglect had never once earned him the chance to practice, waited exactly as long as the steadying took, and then leaned in and accepted the offered scent with the same grave, unhurried attention he gave everyone who finally stopped pretending. A small human cadet in the second row, one of this cycle's 6, a boy who'd introduced himself at muster as Denny Acaffer and said almost nothing since, raised his hand with the particular hesitance of someone who'd been taught, somewhere along the way, that questions were a risk. "Instructor Talbot, is it true you kept them hidden for 6 months before anyone found out?" "In a loft." "It's true. Weren't you scared the whole time?" Wren considered the question longer than its size probably warranted, because she'd been asked some version of it a dozen times over 18 months of visits and had never quite settled on an answer that felt complete. "I was scared every day," she said finally. "Scared of being caught. Scared they'd die anyway, no matter what I did. Scared I wasn't enough some nights to keep 2 dying animals alive on stolen rations and no training. She looked at Ash, grown now past anything the loft could have contained, standing patient and enormous in the classroom doorway. Being scared never stopped me from doing the next small thing that needed doing. That's the part nobody tells you at muster. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's just fear that decided to keep working anyway. Denny Akafer wrote that down. So Wren noticed, did 3 other cadets, and she felt the small, strange satisfaction of watching a sentence she'd never planned to say become something someone else might carry into their own hardest season. Denny found his own cull crate 11 weeks into that rotation, the way Wren had somehow known, watching him write down her answer in that first orientation class, that he eventually would. It wasn't a Duskwardin or a Vorlynx this time. Praxis Reach's pen wards had diversified since the reforms, taking in orphan stock from 3 neighboring settlements that had none of their own facilities for it. And the animal Denny found curled in a supply crate behind Ward 4 was a species Wren didn't recognize on sight. A small quilled thing with 2 large eyes and a low, distressed keening that carried through the whole ward when she came to see what the fuss was about. Rockdon kit, Petra said, checking the tag on the crate. Cave-nesting species from the southern ridge settlements. Run of a litter the settlers couldn't feed through the dry season. Happens most years, apparently, when the water table drops. Penmaster logged it for the standard review process. She looked at Denny, who hadn't moved from beside the crate since he'd found it, hands white-knuckled on the rim. Which, since the reforms, takes 30 minutes and doesn't require anyone to hide in a loft for 6 months first, in case that wasn't clear. I know the process, Denny said, not looking up. I just wanted to sit with her until someone official got here. Didn't seem right, leaving her alone in a box the way she probably already spent her whole first week. Wren watched him from the ward doorway, watched the particular careful stillness he held around the kit. Not the panicked secrecy she'd once needed, not the practiced hiding Petra had needed after her, just an ordinary cadet doing an ordinary kindness, because the installation had finally built a structure where kindness didn't require 6 months of stolen rations and terror first. She thought of DOS's revised recommendation, the one that had invented a paperwork format that hadn't existed the morning it was needed. She thought of a penmaster once deciding a dying hatchling wasn't worth the feed, and another penmaster, years later, filing paperwork himself rather than let a second case die the slow institutional death the first one nearly had. You know, Wren said, coming to crouch beside him, we used to call this kind of thing reckless. Now the registry calls it standard intake procedure. Funny how fast reckless turns into standard once enough people decide the reckless thing was right all along. Denny finally looked up. Is it always going to work out, every time? No, Wren said, honest, because she'd learned a long time ago that false comfort curdled faster than any true difficulty. Some of them don't make it, even now, even with everything we've built. Some bonds never form. Some animals just want to be animals, not partners, and that's a fair thing for them to want too. But the ones that do make it are worth every one that doesn't, and you don't get to know in advance which is which. You just do the next small thing that needs doing and you find out. The Rockdon kit, Denny named her Quill. 3 days later, once the review had cleared and the crate had become a proper nesting box in the corner of Ward 4 nearest the heat coil, never grew into anything as dramatic as a war beast or a formal Denkin bond recognized by assembly vote. She grew, instead, into an ordinary, contented cave nester who followed Denny around the ward on quiet evenings and never once needed to prove anything to anyone. And Wren found, watching the 2 of them from a respectful distance most weeks, that she'd come to treasure the unremarkable ones just as fiercely as the extraordinary ones. That the whole point, in the end, had never been about producing more war beasts or more assembly votes. It had been about building a place where staying, in whatever small and unspectacular form it took, was finally allowed to be enough. That evening, in the ward, with Caro stretched across the doorway and Ash curled against his flank in a mirror of a pose she'd once found impossible to imagine either of them holding, and Fen perched watchful in the rafters above, Wren sat down to write the letter she'd been putting off for 3 weeks, to an uncle back on Earth who had raised her after her parents shipped out on a decade-long survey contract neither of them regretted taking, and neither of them had managed, yet, to come home from. Uncle Hale, she wrote, they made a formal announcement at the Coalition Summit last month. I wasn't there, but Envoy Ilhan sent the transcript. Apparently the debate about extending human cadets full combat clearance has been stalled for 6 years, and apparently a registry bulletin about a girl and a war beast tipped it. I don't fully understand the politics. I understand that Denny Akhafer, 6 years older than I was when I started, gets to train with live handling protocols in his 2nd year instead of his 5th, because someone above my rank decided humans weren't the liability everyone assumed. I didn't set out to change anyone's mind about anything. I just didn't want to watch something die that didn't have to. Funny how the second thing sometimes does the first thing's job for it if you stay with it long enough. Caro says hello in his way. Ash is taller than him now, which nobody predicted and which he seems, in his own unreadable fashion, quietly proud of. Fen bit a visiting quartermaster last week for reaching for my shoulder without announcing himself, which the quartermaster took, after some initial shouting, surprisingly well. I think I'm staying out here past my rotation. I think you already knew that before I wrote it down. Tell Mom and Dad when the survey relay reaches them that their daughter finally found the thing she's good at. It took a dying lizard in a crate to show me. I'm not sure that's the lesson anyone expects, but it's the one I got, and I'm not giving it back. She sealed the letter, set it aside for the morning relay, and sat a while longer in the quiet ward, listening to Caro's slow breathing and Fen's occasional restless shift in the rafters and Ash's low, contented rumble against its elder's flank, and let herself, for one unhurried evening, simply be still inside the thing she'd built. The summons to appear before the Coalition Assembly came 4 months later, carried by a courier ship rather than a routine bulletin, which told Wren before she'd even opened the seal that whatever this was, it outranked every consultation visit she'd made so far combined. They want you in person, Vash told her, reading the same summons over her shoulder in his office, his silver mane more gray now than it had been 2 years earlier, though his posture hadn't softened an inch. Not a transcript, not a bulletin. The full assembly on the capital world, addressing the human combat clearance extension directly. There's a block of older delegations still voting against it, the ones who remember your species' first coalition decade and haven't updated the memory since. Envoy Ilhan believes a personal appearance could move the final votes needed. They want me to bring Caro. They want you to bring exactly what walked into that Proctor's Hall 2 years ago and changed everything after it. I imagine that includes the war beast. He studied her a moment. You don't have to go, Wren. Your rotation here doesn't require it, and I won't pretend the capital world's older delegations are known for warmth toward junior officers who make them look short-sighted in open session. I'll go, Wren said, and didn't need to think about it any longer than that. The assembly chamber on the capital world was larger than anything Wren had stood inside in her life. A vast tiered amphitheater of dark stone and cool blue light. Delegations from 40 member species arranged in concentric rings around a central speaking floor. The whole structure built, she thought, looking up at the impossibly high vaulted ceiling, to make anyone standing at its center feel exactly as small as the assembly wanted them to feel. Caro walked the speaking floor beside her, undaunted by the scale of the room in a way Wren found she envied. Whatever calculations mattered to him, the size of a chamber apparently wasn't among them. The delegate who rose first to challenge her was an elder Thren from one of the founding worlds, robes heavy with seniority markings, voice pitched with the particular weary patience of someone who had sat through a great many junior officers' well-meaning testimonies and expected this to be another. "Instructor Talbot," he said, "I have read the registry bulletin. I do not dispute the events it describes. I dispute the conclusion this assembly is being asked to draw from them, that one exceptional bond between one exceptional cadet and one exceptional animal justifies rewriting 11 years of carefully calibrated policy regarding an entire species' combat readiness. Exceptional cases make poor foundations for general law, instructor. Surely you understand that better than anyone in this chamber." "I understand it," Wren said. "I'd ask the delegate one question before I answer the rest. How many exceptional cases does a policy need before it stops being fair to call them exceptions?" A murmur moved through the tiered ring. The elder Thren's jaw tightened, very slightly, in a way that reminded Wren, with a small jolt, of another Thren's jaw tightening in another room 2 years earlier, right before an argument he'd been certain of started coming apart in his hands. "There is a registry bulletin bearing my name," she continued, before he could answer. "There is a second one bearing Cadet Petra Voss's name, filed at the same installation 8 months later. There is a third from Faro Hollow and a fourth from a station I won't pronounce correctly if I try, and by the time this assembly finishes debating whether my species is capable of trust, there will likely be a fifth. I'm not asking this chamber to rewrite policy because of one girl and one war beast. I'm asking because 11 years of policy built on the assumption that humans would panic, would flinch, would do something reckless with responsibility we hadn't earned yet, has instead produced installation after installation where the only cadets willing to sit with a dying animal until it either lived or didn't were the ones your policy trusted least to try." She let that settle. "I didn't earn Caro's trust by being fearless, delegate. I earned it by staying through the part where I was afraid and useless and untrained, and did the next small thing anyway. That's not a quality unique to me. It's not even unique to my species. It's just the one thing your combat readiness assessments have never once measured, because it doesn't show up on a strength chart or a reflex test. It only shows up when something's dying in a crate at 3 in the morning, and nobody official is watching." She turned deliberately and rested one hand flat against Caro's scarred flank, the old collar brand still faintly visible beneath the fur even after 2 years of proper feeding and proper care. "This is what 11 years of your policy did to the one animal it trusted with actual responsibility," she said. "It kept him lean for an edge, calibrated a pain instrument past regulation ceiling, and called the result discipline. I'd ask this assembly to consider, honestly, whether the caution it's been extending to my species for 11 years has been protecting anyone from recklessness, or whether it's simply been protecting an old assumption from the discomfort of being wrong." The vote was called 2 days later. After 4 more sessions of testimony Wren mostly sat through in silence, Caro beside her the entire time, patient and watchful and entirely unbothered by the weight of history moving slowly around him. The clearance extension passed by a margin wide enough that even the elder Thren delegate, according to the transcript, Yesney forwarded her afterward with 3 exclamation points and no other comment, had abstained rather than vote against it outright, which Ilhan told her, later, over a quiet dinner in the capital's officer quarters, was as close to a public apology as that particular delegate's culture permitted anyone of his rank to make. Wren didn't feel triumphant reading the final tally. She felt mostly tired in the specific way that came from carrying something heavy long enough that setting it down finally registered as relief rather than victory. She thought of a cull crate behind Ward 9, and a runoff channel near the Vorlinks Warren, and a room full of 40 cadets going silent the way a room goes silent right before someone gets hurt. She thought that the room, this time, had gone quiet for an entirely different reason, and understood that this, more than any single vote, any single ceremony, any single headline the sector's news relays would run for a week before moving on to the next thing, was the actual shape of what she'd built. Envoy Ilhan found her afterward, on a terrace overlooking the capital world's lower districts. Caro settled beside her bench with the patient stillness of an animal who had decided days ago that the endless stone corridors of this world held nothing worth his vigilance anymore. "You did something today that 4 centuries of careful diplomatic incrementalism failed to manage," Ilhan said, joining her at the rail. "I've spent my career believing change here moves only in small, exhausting increments, each one fought for a decade before the next becomes possible. I am forced to reconsider that, watching you." "I didn't do it alone," Ren said. "I had a war beast standing next to me the whole time, and about a dozen registry bulletins doing most of the actual arguing before I ever opened my mouth." "You say that as though it diminishes the point rather than proving it." Ilhan studied her a long moment, the capital world's amber evening light catching the silver thread at her collar. "Do you know what the oldest Denkin record in our registry actually says, Cadet Talbot, the one from 4 centuries ago, the one too degraded to confirm with certainty? A single line, translated imperfectly across a dozen intervening centuries of language drift. It says, 'She stayed, and so it stayed, and neither one of them was ever alone again after that.' I used to think it was myth language, ornamental, the kind of phrase old records accumulate to sound more significant than the facts underneath them. I don't think that anymore." Ren looked down at Caro, at the old scarring along his flank that had never fully faded, at the steady rise and fall of his breathing in the fading light, and thought of a data relay she hadn't yet sent, sitting queued on her slate since the vote had cleared that afternoon, addressed to an uncle on a world 3 months transit away who had raised a niece he still didn't fully understand, into someone who just moved an entire coalition's policy by refusing, once, to put a dying animal back in a crate. Her uncle's reply reached her 11 weeks later, delayed by the same interstellar relay lag that had always governed every conversation she'd had with home since the day she shipped out. It was short, the way his letters had always been short, unpracticed with words the way she'd once been unpracticed with speeches. "Read about the vote in a coalition digest your mother's survey ship picked up on relay," it read. "Didn't recognize half the terminology. Recognized you completely. Your father cried, which he'll deny if you ask him, so don't. We always knew you had it in you to do something like this. We just didn't know it would take a dying lizard to prove it to everybody else. Come home someday if this frontier of yours ever lets you go. Bring the war beast. I want to meet the thing that's kept my niece so stubbornly alive out there." She read it twice, then a third time, sitting in the ward with Caro's flank warm against her side, and understood that some distances, even at 3 months transit lag, never really felt as far as the silence used to. She returned to Praxis Reach to find that the installation had kept moving without her, the way installations always did, and that some of what it had built in her absence had nothing to do with her at all. It happened on a routine tracking drill, the kind of exercise Ren normally would have supervised herself but had missed that week, still catching up on rotations after the Capital World trip. A junior cadet, one of Denny Ockhafer's classmates, a sylph named Cortal running his first live terrain exercise, took a bad step on the northern flats loose shale and went down a ravine slope faster than his species' careful, deliberate gait was built to recover from, tumbling into a rockfall zone the drill instructors hadn't flagged because nothing had triggered it in 6 years of running the same course. Ash found him first. Ren heard the story secondhand, 3 separate times from 3 separate witnesses, before she managed to piece together a version she trusted, because every cadet who told it seemed to have watched a slightly different miracle. What she was fairly certain of, that Ash, running the drill's perimeter alongside the training cadets the way it had taken to doing on its own initiative most seasons now, without instruction, had heard the fall before any human ear on that ridge registered it. That it had gone down the loose shale slope in a controlled skid, no adult Duskwarden should have been able to execute without losing its footing entirely, planted itself beneath the worst of the rockfall's path, and taken 2 glancing hits from tumbling stone across its own armored back, rather than let either one reach the cadet pinned below. That when the drill instructors reached the ravine floor 8 minutes later, they found Cortal alive, shaken, one arm badly bruised but unbroken, curled instinctively against the flank of an animal 3 times his mass that had simply refused, without anyone's order, to let a stranger die on ground it happened to be patrolling. Wren found Ash back at the ward that evening, 2 shallow scrapes along its spine plate that the infirmary staff had already tended, Caro pressed close beside it in a posture Wren recognized. She'd seen it once before, in a training yard 2 years ago, an elder checking a younger one over with a thoroughness that had nothing predatory left in it. Finn sat perched on the ward's outer wall, tail lashing with something that looked, in the low evening light, almost like pride. "You didn't have to do that either," Wren said, kneeling to press her palm flat against the scraped plate, feeling Ash lean into the touch the way it had leaned into her collarbone as a hatchling half its current size. "Nobody trained you to run drill perimeters. Nobody ordered you into that ravine." Ash didn't answer, because Ash had never answered in words, not once in 2 years. But it turned its great scarred head, its own scarring now, earned honestly on its own ground, protecting someone it had met an hour before the fall, and looked at her with the same steady ember eyes it had looked at her with the day it chose to make a greeting call instead of run. And Wren understood, kneeling there in the fading light with 2 hands full of a story that had grown so far past her own small part in it, she could barely see the shape of the original crate anymore. That this was never a lesson she'd taught him. It was one she'd learned right alongside him, the 2 of them figuring it out together, one small, stubborn decision at a time. Cortal came by the ward the next morning, still favoring the bruised arm, to press a strip of proper trail rations, not stolen this time, purchased with his own credits, deliberately into Ash's waiting jaws, and to stand a while in respectful silence while the duskwarden accepted the offering with the same grave, unhurried attention Caro had once given a shaking young Thren cadet's outstretched hand. Wren watched from the doorway and said nothing, because some ceremonies, she'd learned, didn't need an instructor's narration to mean what they meant. The years that followed settled into a rhythm Wren had never let herself imagine, back in the days of stolen ration credits and a heat coil nobody had inventoried. Petra Voss finished her own cadet rotation and stayed on as the ward's second instructor, Bramble grown into a lean, watchful presence who had never quite forgiven Fenn for an early territorial dispute over the ward's western corner, and never quite stopped seeking him out anyway. The 2 of them settling, over time, into the particular grudging companionship of animals who decided mutual suspicion was its own kind of respect. Denny Okafor graduated near the top of his intake class and requested, to nobody's surprise, a beast discipline specialization. Wren signed his transfer papers herself, and did not tell him, though she suspected he already knew, that she'd requested the same specialization at the same age and been told, gently but firmly, that human cadets weren't cleared for it yet. Cole Hasker's supply cutter route brought him back through the sector twice a year, and twice a year he found an excuse to dock at Praxis Reach a day longer than his manifest strictly required. And twice a year Fenn permitted him the full run of the ward without so much as a warning growl, which both of them had long since stopped commenting on out loud. Yeseni Corps' cross-species curriculum spread to 6 installations by the 4th year, carried by a wave of newly commissioned Denkin liaison instructors who had never met Dreeth Van, and would only ever know his name as a cautionary footnote in the training materials Yeseni had written specifically to make sure it stayed that way. Somewhere in a supply depot 3 systems out, Wren understood, a man was still processing inventory manifests for a garrison too small to need him, and she found, examining the thought the way she occasionally still did, that she genuinely no longer cared to know more than that. Osek Rin made junior officer in his 4th year and requested, on his own initiative, a rotation supervising the Den Watch's expanding roster. A decision that struck exactly nobody, who remembered a strip of dried meat offered at an odd hour, years earlier, by a cadet who would rather have died than admit what he was doing. The intelligence officer Fane sent a relay 18 months after the raid, brief and businesslike, in the way all her communications had been, informing Wren that the interrogations of the 4 captured raiders had finally traced back far enough through a chain of shell buyers and frontier fences to identify the trafficking network's regional coordinator, a broker operating out of a debris-field station, well beyond any single coalition installation's jurisdiction, who had spent the better part of a decade selling rare bonded predators to private collectors on worlds where nobody asked inconvenient questions. A joint patrol task force, assembled from 3 sectors worth of frontier cutters, once the pattern became undeniable, took the station in a single coordinated strike that autumn. Fane's relay didn't dwell on the details, only the outcome. The broker in coalition custody, the stations holding pens, 3 other bonded or partially bonded animals recovered alive, taken before their own Denkin claims had ever been given the chance to form, reunited, where reunification was still possible, with handlers who had spent months believing their cases lost for good. Wren read the relay standing in the ward doorway, Caro's flank warm against her side, and felt something in her chest loosen that she hadn't fully realized was still clenched. She thought of the 2 shaking men Caro had pinned in a doorway, of Ash trembling in a transfer crate at 4 hours before dawn, of a market that had priced her family the same way it priced fuel cells and salvage, a resource, not a bond, something to be extracted and resold with no more consideration than the raiders had given the settlers' terror hounds on that scrub plain months later. She didn't feel triumphant reading the outcome, any more than she'd felt triumphant reading the assembly's final tally. She felt instead the particular quiet relief of a debt finally called due, a threat that had once stood at the edge of everything she'd built finally closed off for good, not by anything dramatic she'd done herself, but by the patient, unglamorous work of people whose names she'd likely never learn, doing the next necessary thing because somebody had to. She forwarded the relay to Petra and Yeseni without comment, and found the next morning that Caro had resumed his old habit of pacing the ward's outer wall at dusk anyway. Not out of any renewed alarm, she came to understand over the following weeks, but simply because vigilance, once earned the hard way, didn't switch off the moment the specific threat that taught it was gone. It simply widened, quietly, into a permanent kind of care, the same care that had first found her in a coal crate behind Ward 9, and never once, in all the years since, found a reason to stop. Commandant Vash retired the year Ash turned 4, his silver mane gone fully white, and at the small ceremony marking his departure, he pulled Wren aside one final time, the way he had in an office 2 years into her cadet rotation, and told her, without ceremony, that the installation's registry now listed 7 confirmed Denkin bonds across its active roster, more than every other coalition academy combined, and that the number had a name attached to it, whether the official record credited her explicitly or not. "I did not believe it the first afternoon," he said. "I want you to know that. I stood on that platform and watched a war beast lie down at your feet, and some old, careful part of me still cataloged it as an anomaly worth investigating rather than a truth worth trusting. It took the second incident, the raid, watching that hatchling stand its ground against a raider 3 times its mass, before I stopped filing what I was seeing under exception and started filing it under evidence." He looked past her toward the ward, toward Caro, older now, gray threading the scarred hide along his flank, still watchful, still unhurried, still exactly where he chose to be. "I am glad I was wrong about the timeline, Cadet. I am gladder still that you never once needed my belief to keep doing what you were already doing before I caught up to it." Wren thought about that conversation often, in the years after, turning it over the way she still occasionally turned over the note that had once read only good instincts, instructor. Keep them, and understood each time that it captured something true about the whole shape of what had happened on this moon. That belief had always arrived last, trailing behind the actual work by however long it took the people watching to stop protecting an old assumption from the discomfort of being wrong. Ash's final growth spurt came the season after Vash's retirement, and with it came something Praxis Reach's registry had no formal category for at all, because no Duskwarden bond in 400 years of spotty, half-verified record-keeping had ever produced a second adult from within the same den before. Wren noticed it first in small things, Ash beginning to range the perimeter at dusk unprompted, the same slow, methodical casting Caro had once taught himself out of 11 lonely years of vigilance. Ash positioning itself at the ward's outer door on nights Caro chose to rest fully rather than half-watch. She thought at first that it was simple imitation, a younger animal copying an elder's habits the way Ash had once copied the deliberate care of her hands braiding cord. She understood it was something else the evening she watched Caro, unprompted, lower his scarred head and press it once, briefly, against Ash's newly broad chest. A gesture she'd never seen him make with any creature but herself in 6 years of close observation, and then step back, deliberately, from the ward's outer doorway. The post he had held every single night since the loft above Ward 9 had first become a shared den instead of a hiding place. He didn't leave. He simply moved to the wall's inner corner and lay down, watchful still but no longer positioned as the first line between the ward and whatever the dark might hold. And Ash, without any command from Wren, without any signal she could identify beyond whatever passed silently between two of the same rare species who had each, in their own way, learned everything they knew about staying from watching the other do it first, settled into the doorway Caro had vacated, and took up the watch. She didn't have a word for what she'd witnessed, and neither, when she described it to Envoy Ilhan the following week, did the registry's 4 centuries of Denkin scholarship. Ilhan filed it, eventually, under a designation she coined on the spot, the same way she'd once invented Wren's own instructor title out of necessity rather than precedent. A den transfer, the formal passing of a Duskwarden's watch duty from an elder to a fully grown younger bonded to the same den, recognized for the first time anywhere in the registry's history, because no den, in 400 years of record-keeping, had ever been allowed to grow large enough, or stay together long enough, for anyone to document what came after the cub grew up. Caro did not stop watching entirely. Some habits, Wren understood by now, ran too deep in a heart shaped by 11 years of vigilance to ever fully set down, but he rested more, that season and the ones after it, curled in the ward's warmest corner while Ash held the door, and Wren found, watching the two of them settle into that new unhurried rhythm, that it was the closest thing to peace she had ever seen either of them wear. Envoy Ilhan's registry office asked, once the den transfer designation had been formally logged, whether Wren wanted the finding publicized alongside the other Denkin records. Another bulletin, another wave of installations writing in for consultation, another small ripple through a coalition that had already rewritten a fair portion of its assumptions on her account. She declined, gently, and told Ilhan the truth of it rather than any diplomatic softening, that some things belonged to the animals who'd earned them rather than to the record that catalogued them, and that Caro, in particular, had spent 11 years as a line item in somebody else's ledger before he'd ever been allowed to simply exist as himself. He'd earned the right, she thought, to grow old without a bulletin narrating it. Ilhan didn't argue. She simply noted the finding as restricted, registry eyes only, and never brought it up again, and Wren understood that as its own quiet form of respect, one careful woman, in a diplomatic corps built almost entirely out of public record and formal proceeding, choosing to let one private thing stay private, because some staying didn't need an audience to be real. The cordwork discipline elective, absurd as its founding had been, was in its 3rd full season by then, and Wren still taught it herself twice a rotation, mostly because she'd never quite worked up the will to hand off the one class on the installation that still made her laugh out loud most weeks. She stood at the front of a practice yard one bright morning with a coil of spare cord in each hand, watching a fresh crop of second years attempt, with the same earnest, uneven concentration Ash had once brought to the same task years earlier, to braid a simple lead line under the solemn supervision of their own bonded partners. A Corrigal cadet's young warhound sniffing critically at a badly tangled knot. A Sylph cadet's insected partner observing the whole exercise with the patient stillness her species used instead of visible amusement. Denny Ockhaffer's Rockdon kit quill curled in a patch of sun, and taking no interest in the proceedings whatsoever, which Denny had long since stopped apologizing for. "I want to be clear," Wren told them, the way she told every new class, "that there is no actual combat application to this exercise. I know the name suggests otherwise. I did not choose the name. A Sylph cadet 3 years ago decided a piece of string I used to keep a hatchling from chewing through my supply lines was secretly a covert training curriculum, and the name simply refused to die after that, the way most good nonsense does once enough people repeat it in front of an instructor too tired to correct them." "Then why do we do it, instructor?" A young Thren cadet, Ernest, knew enough that she still flinched slightly whenever her own bonded partner shifted weight beside her. "Because your hand's doing something slow and careful in front of an animal that trusts you, teaches it something no drill manual can put into words," Wren said. "It teaches it that you'll keep showing up for the boring parts too. Loyalty built entirely out of dramatic rescues is thin loyalty, in my experience. The kind that holds is built mostly out of afternoons exactly like this one, nothing happening, nobody watching, just two creatures deciding, over and over in the smallest possible way, that they're going to keep choosing each other." She nodded at the cadet's badly tangled knot. "Try it again. Slower this time. Let her watch you get it wrong before you get it right. That matters more than you think." She watched them work through the morning, cord and patience and the particular unhurried rhythm that had once, in a hidden loft above Ward 9, been the only curriculum she'd had to teach herself, with no manual, no instructor, just a dying hatchling and a drowning kit, and 6 months of afternoons exactly like this one. Nothing happening, nobody watching. A girl deciding, over and over in the smallest possible way, that she was going to keep choosing them. A coalition registry historian came through that same season, cataloging verified Denkin claims for an archival project Envoy Ilhan's office had commissioned once the number of confirmed bonds crossed into double digits sector-wide, and asked Wren, over 2 long afternoons of recorded interview, to walk through the events of that first Tuesday in the Proctor's Hall one final time for the permanent record. "Most accounts I've collected from witnesses describe the same moment," the historian said, an older Sylph woman with the careful, unhurried cadence of someone who had spent a long career listening more than speaking. "The instant Caro lay down. Every single witness statement uses some version of the same phrase, that the room went silent, that no one could quite believe what they were seeing. I'm curious whether it felt that dramatic from where you were standing." Wren considered the question for a while, the way she still considered most questions about that afternoon, turning it over for whatever true thing was left in it after so many retellings had worn the edges smooth. "It didn't feel dramatic," she said finally. "It felt like the only thing that made sense. I'd spent 6 months learning that animal's species from the inside, watching what worked and what didn't with a dying hatchling nobody else thought was worth the effort. When Caro put his head down, I wasn't shocked. I was relieved. I think that's the part the witness statements miss, because they were all standing at the rail, seeing something impossible happen to somebody else. I was standing in the middle of it, and from there, it didn't look impossible at all. It looked like 6 months finally paying off." And yet the title the sector's news relays gave it, when the story first spread, I've seen at least 4 variations, but they all land on some version of the same idea, that everyone watching was shocked, That something unbelievable happened right in front of them. The historian tilted her head, antennae drifting into the slow considering sweep her species used for genuine curiosity rather than alarm. Does it bother you that the story people tell isn't quite the story you lived? No, Wren said and meant it. Let them have the shock. It's not wrong, exactly. I watched 40 cadets' whole understanding of what a war beast could become apart in about 4 seconds, and I understand why that's the part worth remembering, if you're the one it happened in front of instead of the one it happened to. I just know, underneath the version everyone tells, there's a much slower, much less dramatic version that's actually true. Somebody stayed. That's the whole story, every time, no matter how loud the ending gets. Everything people find shocking afterward is just what staying looks like, finally, from the outside. The historian wrote that down too, the way Denny Ockhafer once had, and Wren understood watching her do it, that some version of that sentence would likely outlive every one of them. Outlive the ward, outlive the registry bulletin, outlive even the particular shape of the war beast currently asleep in the ward's warmest corner, and would keep doing, for cadets neither of them would ever meet, exactly what it had done for a scared, stubborn 19-year-old 2 years into a rotation nobody believed in yet. Give the next person permission to stay, long before anyone official was watching to call it brave. Fenn alone, of the 3, had never grown into anything the registry found a formal category for, and Wren suspected he preferred it that way. He'd stopped growing years earlier at a size that still startled visiting officers expecting something more imposing from an animal with his reputation, and he wore the mismatch between his size and his ferocity, the way some people wore a joke they never got tired of telling. He still patrolled the ward's perimeter every dusk, still bid exactly 1 new arrival per season on some private schedule only he understood, still climbed to the same rafter each night to watch the door before finally consenting to curl, eventually, into the crook of Wren's shoulder the way he had the very first week she'd hand-fed him with a stolen dropper in a hidden loft. He had never once, in all the years since, let more than a room's width sit between them for longer than he judged necessary, and Wren had long since stopped trying to talk him out of it, understanding, the way she understood most things about her small, strange family by now, that some loyalties didn't need explaining. They only needed to be let alone to keep doing what they'd always done. New cadets asked about him constantly, drawn by the outsized stories, the quartermaster's boots, the raider's forearm, the sheer improbable size of the reputation attached to something that fit easily in both her arms. Wren answered the same way every time, watching Fenn watch the questioner back with his flat, unbothered gold eyes. He was the smallest one anybody expected to matter, she told them, and the first one who ever proved, in a runoff channel behind a warren nobody had bothered to check twice, that mattering was never about size to begin with. It was about who showed up, and who stayed showing up, long after the crisis that first brought you together had passed. There was a night, some years into all of it, when Wren woke to Fenn's low warning growl and found herself moving before she'd fully surfaced from sleep, the old instinct never quite worn smooth by time the way she'd once assumed it would be. She found him at the ward's outer wall, hackles raised, staring out into the dark toward the perimeter fence, and found Caro already awake beside him, head up, nostrils working the night air in the same slow, methodical sweep he'd used the week before the raid, years earlier, when nothing on the installation had known yet to be afraid. It turned out to be nothing. A supply drone off its patrol route, malfunctioning, drifting too close to the pen wards before an automated failsafe corrected its course and sent it humming back out over the flats. Wren stood in the cold night air a long while after it passed, one hand resting on Caro's flank, feeling his pulse slow gradually back to its unhurried rhythm, and thought about how strange it was, after everything, that the reflex had never dulled in either of them, that some part of both the war beast and the girl who'd once fed him nothing but patience and stolen rations still stood watch, every night, against a threat that had only ever come once, years ago, and never returned. "You don't have to keep doing that," she told him, quiet, the way she still talked to him sometimes, not expecting words back and never quite stopping herself from offering them anyway. "It's over. We won. You can rest." Caro turned his great scarred head toward her, ember eyes steady in the dark, and made a low sound that carried no translation she'd ever fully pinned down, though she'd come, over the years, to understand it well enough, not disagreement exactly, but something closer to a simple, settled fact he had no interest in arguing about. That rest and watchfulness had never been opposites to him. Not once. Not for 11 years of neglect, and not for however many years of care came after it. That staying meant staying all the way through, every night, whether or not the danger ever came back to test it. She understood, standing there, that this was the truest thing anyone had ever taught her, more than any registry bulletin or assembly vote or ceremony full of applause. That the whole of what she'd built on this frontier moon, the whole of what a dying hatchling and a half-drowned kit and a scarred, underfed war beast had given her in return for 6 months of stubborn, unglamorous care, came down to exactly that one unspectacular fact. You didn't earn a pack by being fearless, or strong, or exceptional in any way the old assessments had ever bothered to measure. You earned it by staying through the part where nobody official was watching, and then you kept staying, long after the danger passed, because that was never actually the point where the staying was supposed to stop. Ash found them both at the wall a few minutes later, drawn by some sense of its own that something in the night had shifted, and settled its enormous frame down beside Caro with the same unhurried patience it had learned, apparently, from watching its elder do exactly this 1,000 quiet nights before. Fen climbed to his customary perch on Wren's shoulder, tail curling loose around the back of her neck, and the four of them stood together at the edge of the ward in the cold dark, watching a horizon that held, for the moment, nothing at all worth watching for. Somewhere behind them, deeper in the ward, Quill shifted in her nesting box and settled again, and one of the younger cadets bonded partners. A new arrival Wren hadn't formally met yet, boarded for the week while its own handler recovered from a training injury, let out a soft, uncertain sound in its sleep, the sound of something still learning that this particular ward was safe to make noise in at all. Nobody stirred to quiet it. That, too, Wren had learned, was part of what a den was for, not silence, not perfect order, just enough steady presence around the uncertain sounds that they were allowed to happen without anyone needing to be afraid of what came after them. In the morning there would be cadets to teach, a curriculum to keep expanding, letters from 3 more installations asking for consultation visits she'd already half decided to accept. There would be Petra's steady confidence and Denny's careful questions and Cordell's trail rations and Osek's quiet, stubborn devotion to a rotation nobody had ever formally required of him. There would be, somewhere out past the sector's edge, a whole coalition slowly, unevenly, imperfectly learning to measure a species by something other than the fears it had never had reason to test. There would also, she knew without needing to check any roster, be more crates, more runoff channels, more frightened, undersized, inconvenient lives that some institution somewhere had already decided weren't worth the feed, waiting for someone with no particular authority and no particular strength to walk in, look at the numbers, and simply refuse to accept them. That was the part the registry bulletins never quite captured, no matter how many times the historian's careful transcript tried to pin it down. It wasn't a single afternoon in a proctor's hall, however much that afternoon had changed. It was every ordinary morning after it, stacked one on top of the last, each one asking the same small, unglamorous question all over again, and each one answered the same way, by her and now by Petra and now by Denny, and someday, by cadets none of them had met yet who would walk into their own version of that hall carrying their own 2 dying cubs, certain of nothing except that they weren't putting them back either. But that was the morning's work, and this was still the night's, and Wren Talbot stood at the wall a while longer with a duskwarden, the size of a supply cart pressed warm against one side of her, and a vorlynx curled loose around her shoulders, and a second Duskwardin, taller now than either of them, settling into the watch beside its elder without needing to be asked, and thought, not for the first time, that she had walked into a classroom years ago carrying two dying cubs, certain of nothing except that she wasn't putting either of them back, and that everyone in that room had expected the story to end with her being right about how little she mattered. It had ended, instead, exactly the other way around. Not with a war one, though there had been one of those. Not with a title, though the registry had given her several. It ended, every single night, the same small, unremarkable way it had begun, with a girl who stayed, and a pack that had decided, a long time ago and for good, to stay right alongside her. She reached out and rested her hand against Carol's scarred flank one last time before turning back toward the ward, and felt, under her palm, the steady, unhurried beat of a heart that 11 years of neglect had never quite managed to close off from the one thing it had been waiting the whole time to be offered. It was still beating there in the morning, and every morning after, for as long as either of them had left to give it.